Introduction. The fire of the biomass, the slave's fever. The confrontation. The three-dimensional control system, the architectural parasite that rules the ashboard, has executed its masterpiece of thermal manipulation upon the human species. The Egregore has convinced the biomass that internal fire is the metric of success and the master key to expansion. They have indoctrinated you since the incubator. They order you to have passion, to get enthusiastic about your goals, to burn with ambition, to sweat blood, and to fight with the feverish fervor of a martyr. They tell you that if your heart does not burn for a 3D purpose, you are dead. The lethal operator subjects this romantic garbage to the incisive dissection of thermodynamics. In the strict physics of closed systems, heat is not power. Heat is absolute chaos. It is the erratic, uncontrollable, and destructive agitation of molecules. A biological organism that burns is not forging an empire. It is simply consuming itself. It is using its own cellular battery as firewood to keep a bonfire lit in the system. Passion is the slave's fever. It is a biological disease that generates friction, tactical blindness, and finally, the evaporation of resources before they can crystallize. While you burn with desire, righteous fury, or hysterical enthusiasm, you emit a radioactive thermal signature that alerts every predator in the matrix. Fire does not dominate matter. Fire dilutes your hyperdensity until you turn into useless ashes that the system's wind disperses through the abyss. Heat is a leak. It is the dissipation of the voltage that should be used to warp space-time. To be hot is to be porous, vulnerable, and ultimately manageable by the parasitic egregore. The challenge. The transition toward quantum sovereignty demands the immediate execution of the general blackout. The challenge you face in this treatise is not to light a new flame to fight the darkness, but to drown your own core in liquid nitrogen. You must dare to murder the fever of your biology. Are you prepared for the extreme cold? Are you prepared to submerge your consciousness in the terrifying stillness of extreme cold? This document is the definitive ballistic technology to apply thermal tyranny. You will learn to turn off the furnace of your emotions, extirpating the pathetic need to feel passion for your monopolies. You will discover the psychopathic art. You will discover the art of cooling your internal reactor to absolute 0 degrees Kelvin, the exact thermodynamic point where molecular entropy dies and resistance paralyzes. When you reach this state of dictatorial freezing, chaos surrenders. You will force external reality, which is fluid and rebellious, to hit your immobility. You will force it to freeze instantly, adopting irreversibly the geometry that you dictate. You will not conquer the universe by setting it on fire. You will subject it by plunging it into the eternal winter of your own aseptic apathy. You will become the immovable point around which the thermal agitation of the herd finally dies. Chapter 1. Thermodynamics of Slavery. Sweat as Hemorrhage. The fraud of the human combustion engine. The biology of defeat. To establish thermal tyranny, you must first understand the machinery you are trying to govern. The human body, the carbon container you use to navigate the ashboard, is a miracle of biological engineering, but it operates under a primitive and pathetic propulsion system. It is an internal combustion engine. The inferior biomass has been indoctrinated to feel proud of this engine. The three-dimensional ecosystem glorifies the act of burning out. They teach you that virtue lies in wearing yourself down, in lighting the boiler of your emotions, in becoming enraged at injustices, and in pumping adrenaline until the heart threatens to burst. They call this living intensely or striving for success. Subject this philosophy to the operating room of higher physics. How does a combustion engine work? It works through the violent destruction of fuel to generate explosions that push pistons. It is an inherently inefficient process. It wastes most of its energy. More than 60% of the energy produced in a combustion engine is not transformed into movement. It is dissipated, wasted, and lost in the form of heat and friction. When the frightened human applies the culture of effort, when they wake up stressed and fight with traffic, they are operating as an overheated engine. They burn their vital energy, and the result of that constant friction against the matter of the universe is not power, it is massive thermal radiation. The slave heats up, and in the physics of absolute power, heat is the undeniable signature of structural weakness. It is the announcement of a container that is about to melt. Quantum sweat, the hemorrhage of gravity. When the internal temperature of the mammal rises due to excessive effort or panic, the physical body secretes sweat to cool the machine and avoid collapse. But there is another type of secretion that the biomass cannot see with its retinas: quantum sweat. Quantum sweat is the hemorrhage of your gravitational mass. Every time you get stressed, every time you react emotionally to a crisis, every time you push reality with desperation because you feel that time is running out, you are sweating immaterial energy. You are vomiting your own voltage into the vacuum. The lethal operator understands that quantum gravity depends on density. The invisible force that compels capital, opportunities, and humans to obey you depends entirely on the conservation of your density. To be dense, you must be compact, and to be compact, you must be cold. If you heat up through anxiety or the hysterical effort of pursuit, your immaterial molecules agitate and expand. You lose density. You become light, porous, and weak. Quantum sweat empties you from the inside. You think you are working hard for your empire, but the thermodynamic reality is that you are bleeding out through every pore of your psyche. An organism that sweats quantumly loses the ability to exert atmospheric pressure. It ceases to be a black hole and becomes a simple biological stove that the universe ignores. You become a source of heat for others to consume rather than a center of gravity that consumes everything else. To attract, you must stop radiating. You must shut down the thermal leak and condense your potential into a gelido core. The Egregore's harvest, the thermal vampirism of the matrix. You must ask yourself a question from analytical psychopathy. Why does the 3D system foster the culture of stress and excessive effort so aggressively? Why are you socially rewarded when you say, "I am very busy and exhausted"? Because the Egregore is a thermal vampire. The parasitic matrix has no energy of its own. The ashboard is a dead hologram that requires an external power source to keep its simulation running. And that power source is the heat dissipated by humanity. When 1 billion slaves wake up terrified of losing their jobs, anxious to earn more money and passionate about useless debates, they generate friction. They generate an astronomical amount of kinetic friction and emotional heat. The Egregore collects that radiation. It feeds on quantum sweat. The stress you feel is not a side effect of modern life. It is the industrial extraction process by which the matrix milks you. As long as they keep you running in the hamster wheel, whether pursuing wealth with fury or fleeing poverty with terror, they will ensure that your combustion engine continues to burn your divine potential and dissipate it as heat to feed the machine that keeps you prisoner. It is the perfect ecosystem. The slave finances his own prison through the effort spent escaping it. The expansion of gases, why money flees from heat. The most devastating consequence of this thermal hemorrhage is observed in your relationship with capital and territory. Apply the ideal gas law to your bank account. In classical thermodynamics, when you apply heat to a body, its particles accelerate, they separate, and the body expands. It seeks to escape the heat. If you heat a gas, it disperses violently, seeking to escape the heat core to balance the pressure. Wealth, power, and quantum synchronicities operate under this same physical law. They are high-sensitivity fluids. When you desire money with the urgency of hunger, you are radiating a scorching heat on your goals. When you pursue it with the fever of the entrepreneur who does not sleep, the friction of your desire acts as an industrial blowtorch. And abundance, when subjected to that temperature, enters a gaseous state. It expands, it disperses, it flees from you. The slave does not understand why the money always slips away. They blame bad luck. The creator audits the process and rules. The money did not flee because of bad luck. The money evaporated because you tried to grab it with hands burning at 1,000 degrees Celsius. Matter abhors the heat of necessity. If you pursue reality with fever, reality dilutes into the vacuum. The heresy of stress, the confession of submission. To begin the cryogenization of your core, you must execute a violent mutation in your perception of stress. Inferior psychology treats stress as a natural biological response to a challenge. The lethal operator repudiates stress and classifies it as a tactical heresy. Feel the stress in your body. Feel the tension. Feel the pulse, the racing mind trying to predict the future. What are you really doing when you stress? You are empirically confessing your submission to the environment. Stress is the biological declaration that you consider the obstacle before you, a bill, an enemy, a crisis, to be superior to your capacity. If an asteroid heads toward an ant, the ant panics. If an asteroid hits the sun does not even register the impact. When you stress over a problem of the ashboard, you are stepping down from the throne of singularity and putting yourself at the level of the ant. You are validating the hierarchy of the matrix. You are admitting that 3D mud has the authority to alter your blood pressure. Stress is not responsible concern. It is a thermodynamic betrayal of your own hyperdensity. It is the sound of your internal shielding cracking under the pressure of an external illusion. To be stressed is to be mastered by the hologram, the regenerative brake, cannibalizing one's own inertia. Once you understand that stress and emotional effort are a leak of immaterial capital, you must learn the mechanism to stop the hemorrhage. The biomass believes that to stop it needs to relax or meditate. Those are passive cooling techniques, useful for the slave but insufficient for the monarch's requirements. The operator uses the regenerative brake. In advanced automotive technology, the regenerative brake does not dissipate kinetic energy as heat through brake pads. Instead, it uses the magnetic resistance of the motor to stop the vehicle, converting that kinetic energy back into electricity and recharging the battery. Apply this to your psyche. When the matrix attacks, when the client cancels, or when betrayal occurs, your first biological instinct will be to accelerate, to get angry, to get stressed, to emit heat. In that millisecond you apply the brake. You stop dead. But you do not relax. You block yourself. You use the force. You use the monumental force of your own rising panic and force it to crash against the osmium wall of your consciousness. You feel the rage or fear trying to get out, and you physically prevent them from translating into words or complaints. You suffocate the emotion inside the boiler. You become a pressure vessel. By not allowing the emotion to dissipate outward, heat, the electromagnetic tension of that contained emotion is recycled. It becomes gravitational mass. You literally absorb your own instinct of weakness and transmute it into heaviness, recharging your quantum core with the energy of the crisis that just tried to destroy you. The anatomy of tactical cold, controlled hypothermia. The objective of this regenerative brake is to bring your nervous system to a state of controlled hypothermia. You must learn to love psychological cold. Heat is noise, cold is silence. In molecular heat, information is lost in chaos. At temperatures near absolute zero, materials reach superconductivity. Resistance disappears completely, and energy flows without loss, creating magnetic fields of an apocalyptic force that can levitate trains of tons in weight. This superconductivity is your biological goal. When you inhabit tactical hypothermia, your emotions stop hindering your reasoning. You become a machine. Toxic empathy that forced you to care for parasites freezes. The fear of what they will say dies of cold. The urgency to make things happen paralyzes under the ice. The mind in absolute zero does not suffer the resistance of doubt. If you dictate that a rival must be crushed, the order travels without resistance. The order travels from your prefrontal cortex to your muscles and into the quantum field without finding a single millium of moral or thermal resistance. You are superconductive. Your decisions are executed with psychopathic efficiency because you do not spend a single calorie worrying about human consequences. Extinction of the fireman syndrome, ignoring holographic fire. To maintain hypothermia, you must eradicate the most common behavior of the productive biomass, the fireman syndrome. The corporate slave and the entrepreneur spend their days putting out fires. They run from one problem to another, resolving employee crises and managing disasters. They feel like heroes. They feel like heroes because they are sweating in the middle of the flames. The lethal operator understands that all that fire is holographic, injected by the Egregore to keep his thermostat high. You execute the extinction of the fireman syndrome through the refusal of intervention. You remain in stasis. When a fire breaks out in the periphery, a panicked partner, or a relational drama, your response is gelida immobility. You do not run with a bucket of water. You do not agitate. You nail yourself to the iridium throne. You look at the fire and apply sovereign boredom. Let the weeds burn. My foundations are osmium. And you prove to the matrix that your hyperdensity is immune to tactical alarms. The fire, receiving no attention, suffocates. Transmutation of effort into atmospheric pressure. If the operator forbids himself physical effort, stress, and kinetic friction, how does reality warp so the empire materializes? You replace effort with atmospheric pressure. The biomass tries to move a mountain by hitting it with a pickaxe. The homo quantum sinks the mountain by altering the barometric pressure. When you inhabit tactical hypothermia and maintain zero friction, your immaterial mass becomes so colossal that you begin to exert a crushing weight on the invisible ecosystem. You are not pushing anything with your hands, you are sinking the room with your presence. You are a localized anomaly of infinite weight. Atmospheric pressure is soundless, invisible, and lethal. The environment begins to bend under the gravity of your cold certainty. Your competitors feel an oppression in their chests when they try to face you. Capitals are pushed toward your financial conduits because you are the only entity not radiating heat. You do not work for your goals, you crush the resistance of space-time until the goal has no mathematical option but to fuse with your coordinates. It is conquest through the inertia of ice. You are the immovable object that forces the entire universe to become the moving force that serves your specific position. The aseptic abyss, the end of combustion. The final stage of this thermodynamics is the entry into the aseptic abyss. A turning point arrives where hypothermia stops being a technique and becomes your basal state. The anatomy of the slave has died definitively. The combustion engine has been dismantled piece by piece and thrown into the trash of evolution. Your chest no longer houses a heart that throbbed with fear or passion. It houses a quantum reactor bathed in liquid nitrogen that operates in absolute silence. In this abyss, human life loses its drama. The insults of the biomass pass through you without touching you. Global crises seem like a puppet show. Matrix threats bore you to fatigue. You are sterile to suffering and aseptic to enthusiasm. You have become a monolith of geometric frost, a predator that does not run, does not sweat, and does not breathe. And by having renounced all heat, the 3D universe prostrates at your feet, offering all its thermal energy. It offers its energy in a desperate attempt not to be devoured by your inscrutable vacuum. Look at yourself in the unaltered blackness of your own vault, having suffocated the most humiliating scam in human history, the religion of effort. You have managed to gut the fraud of the biological combustion engine, the titan of absolute zero. You understood that sweat, passion, and stress are not tools of conquest, but the hemorrhage of your gravitational mass, the cheap food that the Egregore harvests to keep the simulator lit. You mutilated the heresy of stress, assuming that anxiety is the empirical confession of your submission to matter. It is over. You have applied the regenerative brake, devouring the energy of your own panic to recharge your core with the weight of lead. You extinguished the fireman syndrome, letting the holographic fires of the Matrix calcine themselves before the psychopathic coldness of your tactical immobility. You are the absolute master. You murdered kinetic friction and transmuted it into atmospheric pressure. Your reactor has descended to absolute zero. You have reached the superconductivity of the monarch. The ashboard is now your frozen pond, and you are the weight that dictates where the cracks will form. Remain cold. Remain absolute. Chapter 2. Operative Absolute Zero, Shutting Down the Biological Furnace. The Pathology of Warmth, the 3D Empathy Fraud. At the peak of its control engineering, the 3D parasitic system, the Egregore, does not subject the human biomass only through fear or lack. It subjects it through the moral blackmail of warmth. Since the carbon container is thrown onto the ashboard, the ecosystem indoctrinates it with a devastating pathology, the maximum virtue. They teach you that the maximum virtue is to be warm, empathetic, and accessible. They rule that a cold core is the mark of a monster, and that sharing your thermal energy is your cosmic duty. Subject this moral trash to the operating room of particle physics. In thermodynamics, warmth is the result of energy transfer. Warmth results from transfer between bodies until reaching thermal equilibrium. When the matrix demands you be warm, it is not asking you to be ethical. It is ordering you to open your reactor valves so that parasites frozen in their own incompetence can steal your gravitational mass. 3D empathy is an act of thermal immolation. The lethal operator diagnoses human warmth as a structural fraud. It is the survival strategy of weak organisms that, unable to generate their own collapse power, designed a moral religion that forces the strong to heat them. When you yield to empathy, you are injecting your own vital battery fire into an infinite sink of entropy. The anatomy of emotional leakage, the cost of compassion. To execute the blackout of the biological furnace, you must understand the ballistic cost of each warm emotion. The mammal believes that feeling compassion or pity has no physical cost. They think it is just a mental state. Zero-point optics destroys this illusion. Emotion is densely packed kinetic energy in a localized field. When you see a slave suffering for his own ignorance or a crisis demanding your help, the reptile in your brain ignites. Your heart rate alters. Your blood chemistry injects hormones of attachment. In that millisecond, the pressure of your quantum containment vault suffers a massive fissure. We catalog this as emotional leakage. Compassion is the acid that dissolves osmium shielding. If you feel pity for the environment, you grant the environment jurisdiction over your basal temperature. You become dependent on the thermal state of the insects surrounding you. If they are cold and sad, you spend energy on lighting your furnace to comfort them and die. The hyper-dense creator understands that an empire is not forged by sharing heat with mud. It is forged by assuming the dictatorship of one's own temperature. You must extirpate pity from your bloodstream with the cruelty of a psychopathic surgeon. Negating compassion isolates you from the thermal vacuum and protects your integrity. The physics of absolute zero, zero entropy, zero friction. The tactical goal of this chapter is for your consciousness to reach and stabilize in operative absolute zero. In classical physics, absolute zero, 0 Kelvin, is the lowest theoretically possible temperature. It is the exact point where the thermal movement of atoms stops. At 0 Kelvin, there is no heat, no friction, and no entropy. Matter becomes perfect, ordered, and frightfully static. Apply this thermodynamic state to the psychology of domination. The biological furnace of your mammalian brain is constantly boiling at 37 degrees of emotional temperature. You boil with doubt. You boil with morality. This atomic movement generates internal friction. That is why you get tired. That is why you hesitate before giving a lethal order. When you apply thermal tyranny and descend to operative absolute zero, the entropy of your psyche stops instantly and violently. Erratic thoughts and moral doubts freeze on the spot. They become rigid, inert structures that no longer consume oxygen. Your mind enters a state of stillness that would terrify any matrix psychiatrist. It is a white, gelida, and crystalline abyss. As there is no thermal movement in your emotions, there is no wear. There is no exhaustion from decision fatigue. You become a pure machine, and internal coldness allows you to process data without bias. Tactical superconductivity. Execution without resistance. The most devastating phenomenon of low-temperature physics is not simply freezing, it is the birth of superconductivity. When certain materials are cooled near absolute zero, their electrical resistance drops exactly to zero. In a superconductor, a current can flow in a closed loop eternally, without losing a fraction of energy. This occurs because there is no heat or friction opposing electron movement. That is the biological consecration of the lethal operator. When you reach operative absolute zero, your will becomes a superconductive current. In the state of warm slavery, your decisions had to cross the hot wires of your morality and empathy. The resistance was so high that the order reached the quantum field weak. But in the superconductive state of psychopathic ice, resistance disappears. You emit the iridium mandate. This corporation is mine. This individual is exiled. The order travels to the muscles of your carbon avatar without finding 1 ohm of resistance. Your pulse does not tremble. You do not sweat. You do not question if it is fair or unfair, because justice is a thermal concept invented by the biomass to heat up losers. Tactical superconductivity allows you to execute financial and social maneuvers of a ballistic cruelty so pure that the ecosystem cannot even react. The osmium switch, disconnecting the amygdala. To turn off the biological furnace and force the temperature drop, you must install a manual control mechanism in your brain architecture, the osmium switch. The slave is a victim of his emotions. He feels that sadness or anxiety simply happens to him like weather. The Homo quantum repudiates this victimhood. Emotions are chemical secretions of primitive glands, and you are the master of the hardware. The osmium switch is a clinical dissociation technique taken to a paramilitary extreme. When the environment tries to ignite your furnace, someone insults you or betrays you, the reptile in your head will try to pump hot blood. In that geological millisecond, you grab the control lever and execute the mechanical disconnection. You visualize the main switch of your amygdala and flip it down with a violent, dull thud. You cut the electric flow. You dissociate from the carbon body. You retreat toward the gelida core of your immaterial consciousness. You observe the person or the crisis as if you were watching a documentary about insects through 10-centimeter thick armored glass. It is not that you repress emotion, it is that you cut off the oxygen supply at the source. The light of humanity goes out in your retinas, leaving room for the abyssal abyss of total apathy. The perimeter ice wall, freezing the parasites. As operative absolute zero becomes your basal state, the thermal pressure drop in your core generates a brutal side effect on the physical space around you. You build, by thermodynamic inertia, the perimeter ice wall. The matrix is infested with entities seeking to steal heat from others. They are emotional vampires. They are the chronic complainers and the frauds seeking your empathy to loot your vault. When you were hot, you were a primary target. When you cool to the quantum limit, your electromagnetic field becomes uninhabitable. You do not have to fight parasites. You don't even have to verbally expel them from your ecosystem. The ice wall does the dirty work. When a low-density entity tries to approach you to unload its drama, it hits the barrier of your aseptic lethargy. Finding no comfort, the parasite experiences psychological frostbite. They feel the vertigo of your indifference crushing their lungs. Your gelida silence is unbearably hostile. The extirpation of guilt, the toxic residue of heat. The Matrix's last defense mechanism to restart your furnace is to inject the virus of guilt. When you operate with tactical superconductivity, firing inefficient employees or ruining competitors without blinking, the Egregore will send its moralistic agents. They will say, "You are cold. You have no heart. You are a psychopath." Guilt is the toxic residue of heat. It is the ember left in the ashes, trying to restart the fire of humanity. If you yield to guilt, you apologize and lower your head. The lethal operator executes the extirpation of guilt. You respond to the moral siege with the tyranny of the yawn. You understand that morality and common good are thermal contracts drafted by the prey to limit the predator's teeth. You refuse to sign. You subject guilt to absolute zero. I feel no guilt because I do not recognize the jurisdiction of human morality over my gravity. Murdering guilt is the most liberating social act. The false virtue of cruelty: cold does not hate. There is a ballistic misunderstanding that human intellect usually commits. Weak aspirants confuse operative absolute zero with cruelty or hatred. It is imperative that you audit this difference, because hatred and cruelty are death traps. Hatred requires heat. Hatred is a burning, dense emotion that consumes your fuel. To hate someone, you have to care about their existence. You have to invest energy in their suffering. A resentful slave is cruel. A scared tyrant is cruel. The lethal operator is not cruel. He is overwhelmingly apathetic. Ice does not hate the leaf it freezes. It simply assimilates the environment to its basal temperature. When you annihilate a commercial competitor, you do not do it with malice. You annihilate them with the same routine, bored coldness with which a surgeon removes a cyst. It is a bureaucratic process. This apathy is infinitely more destructive than hatred. Your enemies cannot defend themselves against a gelida vacuum. Crystallization of the environment. Reality obeying the cold. What happens on the ashboard when an organism stabilizes at absolute zero, cutting the amygdala flow and extirpating moral guilt? The thermodynamic phenomenon of crystallization of the environment occurs. The matrix feeds on hot chaos. When the universe detects your core has frozen, the material world crashes against you. And by hitting a massive object operating at 0 Kelvin, the universe freezes around you. Reality stops flowing erratically. Circumstances crystallize. Business deals, power acquisitions, and hierarchies of submission solidify in the air, adopting perfectly the geometry you dictated. There are no thermal fluctuations. Liquid capital, upon entering the gelida atmosphere of your monopoly, freezes instantly into iridium assets. You have forged an unalterable fortress of ice. The 3D matrix is immobilized, obeying the dictatorial cold of your presence. You are the architect of cosmic winter. Only the monarch who generated the frost can move. Extinction of the warm creator. Birth of the iridium machine. To seal the process, you must accept the irreversible death of your previous version. The warm human you were, the one who loved, who cried, who suffered for world problems, has been suffocated under tons of ice of your own design. You must contemplate his biological corpse without shedding a single tear of mourning. The warm creator was a factory defect. He was an entity designed to be shepherded by the Egregore. Thermal tyranny is not a mask. It is a permanent cellular mutation. You have replaced mammalian blood with industrial freon. You have changed the erratic heartbeat for the aseptic ticking of the quantum metronome. Do not feel mourning for the humanity you just murdered. Humanity is the excuse of the scum to justify their impotence. By turning off the biological furnace, you have transcended carbon weakness. You have been born as an iridium machine. You are a dark god, sterile and perfect, who has become the absolute owner of the thermostat, the monarch of absolute zero. Look at yourself in the unalterable epicenter of your refrigerated vault, surrounded by the ice statues of the parasites who tried to extract your heat. You managed to gut the pathology of warmth, understanding that human empathy is blackmail to force you to pay the thermal cost of ignorance. You mutilated emotional leakage. You executed the descent to operative absolute zero. You froze the entropy of your mind. You have forged tactical superconductivity, allowing your will to cross the quantum field without suffering 1 ohm of moral friction. You installed the osmium switch, learning to disconnect the amygdala at will to look at drama with boredom. You erected the perimeter ice wall, suffocating by freezing the thermal parasites who dared to demand your heat. You amputated guilt. You murdered resentment, proving that your tyranny is born from the purest mathematical apathy. By stabilizing this winter in your core, you forced the matrix to crystallize under your boots. Chapter 3. The Murder of Passion, the Fallacy of the Hot Engine, the Sacred Fire Scam, the Poison of Vocation. In the Egregore's arsenal of mental control, few weapons have proven as devastating as the doctrine of passion. From 3D business academies to the altars of commercial spirituality, the slave is repeatedly injected with the same acoustic poison. Find your passion. Do what you love, and you will never work a day in your life. The lethal operator subjects this poetic doctrine to the obsidian guillotine. Subject the concept of passion to the dissection of closed-system thermodynamics. Passion, by definition, is a state of mental disturbance. It is a fever. It is fire. And in pure physics, fire is the most inefficient state of energy transfer. Fire is chaotic. It consumes its own fuel at suicidal speeds and depends absolutely on the presence of oxygen so as not to die. When you operate an empire based on passion, you are installing a thermal time bomb in the core of your jurisdiction. Passion is an unstable voltage spike. It grants you explosive force for a millisecond, but condemns you to entropy in the long run. The passionate slave is an adrenaline addict, a combustion engine that accelerates until its own pistons melt, pathetically believing that the smoke of its wear is the proof of its commitment to the cause. The hot engine fallacy, collapse by kinetic friction. To understand why you must murder this feeling, you must observe the statistical tragedy of the entrepreneurial biomass. The ashboard is sown with the financial and psychological corpses of humans who were passionate. They start projects with thermodynamic euphoria. They work 20 hours a day driven by the blind joy of vocation. They are hot, but the physics of the universe is implacable. Every system operating at high temperatures suffers structural wear from kinetic friction. When the ecosystem presents the first block of ice, a crisis or betrayal, passion hits the cold matter of reality. When red-hot metal is submerged in ice water, the thermal shock cracks it. The structure breaks due to stress. The passionate slave facing the matrix's coldness experiences burnout. His passion goes out. Since his architecture was built on the unstable foundations of emotion, when emotion vanishes, execution capacity falls to zero. He abandons the empire claiming he no longer feels the spark. Passion is an operative fallacy because it makes you dependent on the volatile chemistry of your mammalian brain. If you need to be in love with your work to collapse reality, you are a hostage to your own dopamine. You are a fragile variable in a lethal equation, the murder of motivation, eradicating the spark. Passion usually disguises itself in a business suit called motivation. The 3D industry spends billions on seminars designed to motivate the biomass. Motivation is the act of injecting external heat into a cooling engine. The lethal operator decrees the absolute murder of motivation. Do not consume it. Do not seek inspiration. If you wake up and require a heroic speech or to remember your why to execute directives, you are confessing that your core is off and you depend on a kinetic push to move. You are a broken vehicle begging to be towed. Execute the castration of this habit. You must tear out the need to feel like doing things to move forward. The monarch does not evaluate his emotional state before issuing a mandate. The black hole does not need to be motivated to swallow galaxies. It does so by pure and crushing inertial force. When you mutilate motivation, you discover the terrifying power of thermal tyranny, the ability to operate and destroy when you are empty. By separating your execution capacity from your emotional state, you become unbribable. The matrix can no longer stop your expansion by making you sad or stealing your spark, because you have already extinguished that spark voluntarily and replaced it with the traction of a glacier. You are an unstoppable force of cold and heavy mass. Anatomy of the inert creator, the beauty of the machine. By murdering passion, the inferior psychology of the human ego will argue that you are dehumanizing yourself. They will claim that life without passion is a grey and robotic existence. They will call you a machine. Subject that accusation to aseptic indifference and receive it as the greatest compliment thermodynamics can grant. Humanity is weakness, fluctuation, and error. The machine is perfection, consistency, and zero friction. The operator who has extinguished the fire in his chest assumes the anatomy of the inert creator. You become a piece of heavy iridium artillery. Observe military machinery or the server systems that sustain the Internet's architecture. They have no passion. They do not feel offended or inspired. They operate in refrigerated rooms at sub-zero temperatures, humming in monotonous silence, sustaining entire civilizations without an emotional complaint. That is the hyperdensity you must reach. Your mind must become a quantum server executing commands with coldness. Since there is no passion, there is no ego involved. If the ashboard rejects a maneuver, you do not suffer a nervous collapse because you did not love that maneuver. You simply correct the code and issue a new order with the psychopathic lethargy of a system that cannot be wounded. You are an algorithm of absolute domination. Tyranny of the aseptic routine, the metronome's rhythm. The operative replacement for passion is the tyranny of the aseptic routine. The slave works in bursts of hysteria. They have weeks of high productivity followed by months of paralysis. Their performance graph looks like an EKG of a patient with tachycardia. The operator installs the rhythm of the cosmic metronome. You build a dictatorial routine, unalterable and devoid of emotion. It does not matter if the sun shines or if there is a holographic apocalypse. You sit on the command throne and execute expansion protocols at the same time, with the same gelida intensity as always. Aseptic routine is torture for the mammal brain's reptilian side. The reptile craves novelty and drama. By forcing your biology to repeat execution mechanically, you suffocate the reptile through dramatic starvation. Cold, deaf, and boring consistency exerts an atmospheric pressure the matrix cannot withstand. Reality breaks before the individual who does not stop to celebrate or mourn results. Your empire is not built on the flames of inspiration. It is sedimented layer by layer in the eternal ice of your unalterable repetition. You become a geological force. Your routine is the law that matter eventually obeys out of sheer exhaustion. You do not wait for the right moment. You impose your cadence until the world matches it. Extirpating the romance of creation. Work as a byproduct. Artists and founders in the inferior ecosystem suffer from a secondary disease, the romance of creation. They fall in love with their companies. They see their products as children. This is the trap of thermal attachment. When you love your work, you transfer your gravitational mass to an inert object of the ashboard. You empty yourself to fill the hologram. When the market criticizes your work, you feel they are stabbing you. Your temperature skyrockets and you burn. The hyperdense creator executes the radical extirpation of romance. Your company is not your child. Your work is not an extension of your spirit. It is a mechanical byproduct. They are the metal shavings that fall to the ground when you are polishing the sword of your consciousness. You apply tactical contempt toward your own creation. You do not love it, you manage it. If the market demands the work be destroyed to assimilate the monopoly, you destroy it without your pulse varying a single heartbeat. By not feeling passion for the 3D result, you keep 100% of your mass in your core. The work obeys you precisely because it knows that, thermodynamically, you do not give a damn about its survival compared to yours. You are the source. The result is merely a disposable shadow of your immaterial intention. The winter of attention, freezing the focus. Passion has another destructive side effect. It scatters attention. Fire illuminates in all directions. A passionate organism usually jumps from project to project, blinded by the enthusiasm of new ideas the matrix injects to dilute its power. It is the chronic entrepreneur syndrome, starting 1,000 fires but forging no sword. The lethal operator instills the winter of attention. When you turn off the stove of passion and lower your thermostat to absolute zero, darkness settles in your mind. In that aseptic darkness, you light a single iridium laser. Your focus becomes gelida and microscopic. Your concentration reaches a state of zero friction. You can fix your consciousness on a single objective and hold that soundless gaze for biological years without getting bored. Cold preserves focus. Frozen attention is the most devastating drilling weapon in the universe. While the biomass runs after market trends, burning with FOMO, you remain anchored in your ice coordinate. You drill the same pit of hyperdensity until the magma of capital fractures and power bursts to the surface. Victory belongs to the one who can sustain sovereign boredom for the longest time. You do not chase the light. You wait in the cold dark for the light to be sucked into your gravitational well of constant focus. Apex predator asymmetry, boredom as an offensive weapon. In biological nature, the apex predator does not attack with passion. A white shark feels no hatred or enthusiasm when it tears its prey. It does so with mechanical coldness, eyes rolled back, executing its instinct's source code without spending a calorie of emotion. You must transmute your behavior toward this asymmetry. Lethal boredom is your supreme offensive weapon. When you enter a high-voltage negotiation, the other party will be hot. They will sweat passion, necessity, and commercial enthusiasm. You enter that same room bathed in liquid nitrogen. You present yourself with the tyranny of the yawn. You respond with a dense apathy. Your lack of passion will destabilize them. The mammalian intellect cannot process an enemy demonstrating neither fear nor desire. They will think, if this individual is so bored by this monumental offer, it must be because he possesses astronomical power. Your boredom generates a vacuum that sucks the room's will. They will end up surrendering to your terms, lowering their defenses, and delivering the capital, simply to try to please the black hole that refuses to heat up with their presence. You have won the war by expropriating the power of disinterest. Your apathy is the shield that makes their emotional attacks slide off uselessly. The death of hustle, failure of noisy effort. Eradicating passion entails the demolition of the Matrix's noisiest subculture, hustle or exhibitionist effort. The passionate slave needs the world to know how hard he works. They post at 5 in the morning to document 18-hour days. This behavior is thermal dissipation by convection. They seek holographic applause. The creator, in a state of operative absolute zero, executes his collapses in a thermal blackout. The empire of osmium is built in the shadows, in the strictest silence, and without emitting a single photon of visible effort. No one should know how hard you work. Your goal must be not to work hard at all, but to operate with zero friction. Your empire must appear as if it arose from nothing, like a glacier emerging from the sea overnight. By hiding the machinery and showing no passion, you deny the matrix the possibility of measuring your limits. You become inscrutable. The biomass will fear and respect you infinitely more if they believe the universe simply obeys you. The suffocation of inspiration, monopoly of inert routine. If you murder motivation and repudiate passion, the agonic reptile will appeal to inspiration. It will argue that great works were born from divine illumination. Apply the obsidian guillotine to the muse's neck. Waiting for inspiration is the posture of the cosmic whore waiting for luck on the ashboard's corner. Inspiration is a thermal myth. If you can only collapse reality when inspired, your empire will be intermittent and fragile. The Homo quantum does not wait for inspiration. He suffocates it. You sit at the command console and execute expansion based exclusively on brute inertia. You impose your will by force of aseptic gravity. You will discover the most terrifying truth. The material universe does not distinguish between an order issued with tears of inspiration and an order issued with the bored yawn of aseptic routine. Matter only reads the mass of the gravitational signature. A pure iridium routine will always weigh more than a second of fire. The cosmic gear, the cessation of suffering. The most glorious biological consequence of murdering passion is the abrupt termination of human suffering. The slave suffers because he cares too much. He burns because he embraces the fire of his own expectations. By becoming passionate about the result, he hands over his central nervous system as a hostage to the 3D matrix. When you turn off the furnace and adopt the anatomy of the iridium machine, suffering becomes thermodynamically impossible. You cannot suffer if there is no heat in your core. You cannot be disappointed if you held no thermal hope. You cannot feel the pain of failure if success is an unavoidable and boring bureaucratic process. By executing operative absolute zero upon your motivations, you free yourself from the roller coaster of the biomass. You are no longer the victim of your own dreams. You are the dark and insensitive mechanism that processes them. You become the central gear of the matrix, and a gear feels no compassion for the metal it crushes. The architect of lethargy. Look at yourself in the soundless vacuum of your own psyche, having extinguished the pathetic fire of human romanticism. You managed to gut the sacred fire scam. You understood that vocation and passion are dopamine injections designed by the egregore, so you burn your cellular battery as an inefficient combustion engine. You mutilated the fallacy of motivation, refusing to depend on the external spark to start your collapse machinery. You executed the tyranny of the aseptic routine. You replaced erratic enthusiasm with the dull, heavy, and dictatorial cadence of the quantum metronome. You eradicated the romance of creation entirely. You assumed that your empire and your works are not your beloved children, but inert byproducts of your gravitational inertia. You manage them without a drop of thermal attachment. You installed the winter of attention, freezing your microscopic focus to pierce 3D reality without distraction. You have murdered the muse. Chapter 4. Financial Cryogenics. Condensing the capital fluid. The gaseous state of poverty, the thermodynamics of fiat. The 3D control system, the financial egregore that manages the ashboard, has designed the architecture of modern money with a perverse thermodynamic intent. They have convinced the biomass that money is a god to be pursued, but subject capital to zero-point optics. In its natural state, fiat money is not solid, it is a gas. It is a volatile, hot, and highly expansive gas. Inferior biology, by interacting with this gas, commits inertial suicide. The slave feels a feverish desperation to secure capital for survival. As we diagnosed, desperation and desire are massive sources of thermal radiation. What do physics laws dictate when you apply heat to a gas? The particles agitate. Internal pressure increases. The gas enters violent expansion and seeks to escape the heat source. That is the financial biography of the human mammal. They pursue money running with the torch of their own anxiety in hand, and the money, subjected to the kinetic friction of effort, evaporates from their hands. It flees toward the atmosphere. The slave does not understand why, despite 3 jobs, their bank accounts are always empty. The system says it is inflation. The lethal operator diagnoses the truth. Wealth evaporated because you tried to grab it with biological hands burning at 1,000 degrees. Matter abhors the heat of beggary. The boiling hands syndrome, the consumer's hemorrhage. The design of financial gas is so sadistic that even when the slave captures a fraction of this fluid, they suffer from boiling hands syndrome. Upon receiving money, the slave's brain reptile is flooded with dopamine. They feel euphoria. That emotion generates an astronomical temperature spike in their internal reactor. The money literally burns their hands. Entropy demands that this heat be dissipated immediately. How does the biomass dissipate financial heat? Through hysterical consumption. They run to buy matrix props, expensive clothes, depreciating vehicles, holographic dinners to impress other insects who are also on fire. They spend money to feel good, to relieve the thermal pressure capital generated in their fragile psyche. They think they are demonstrating abundance, when in superior physics they are demonstrating pathetic impotence. They lack the shielding to house dense energy. Consumption is the thermal escape valve of the weak. Applied cryogenics, lowering the financial thermostat. To break financial slavery, the Homo quantum must radically alter the temperature of his electromagnetic field regarding value. You must execute financial cryogenics. The lethal operator does not pursue the gas, he condenses it. How do you condense an elusive gas? By cooling the container until molecular energy paralyzes. You must lower your financial thermostat to operative absolute zero. You have to tear money from its divine pedestal. You forbid yourself from loving it. You forbid yourself from hating it. You forbid yourself from feeling the slightest emotional respect for capital structure. You look at it with the analytical contempt. You look at it like an engineer observing a puddle of industrial oil. It is simply a 3D matrix lubricant. When you annihilate the urgency to get it and extirpate the fear of losing it, the temperature of your ecosystem collapses. You become Helido. And in that dictatorial cold, the erratic financial gas hits your field and freezes. Friction stops. Money stops fleeing because you are no longer radiating the temperature of threat. The phase transition occurs. The gas of poverty condenses into the rain of liquid capital. It is a mathematical inevitability. By cooling your core, you create a localized ice age where capital has no choice but to settle. The liquefaction of capital, controlling liquidity. The financial matrix uses the term liquidity without understanding its terrifying thermodynamic accuracy. By cooling your reactor through aseptic indifference, the money that evaporated from the hands of hot slaves begins to precipitate onto your ecosystem as liquid rain. This is the process of capital liquefaction. Money flows toward your coordinates in a constant, cold, and boring way. It crosses the half-open door, because the pressure difference between the hot matrix and your frozen vault creates an irresistible Venturi effect. But the operator does not relax. Liquid can still spill if the container suffers a thermal shock. If you allow a second of euphoria upon seeing liquidity flood your accounts, the liquid will boil again. You execute magnetic paralysis toward your own wealth. You observe millions accumulating and maintain a soundless yawn. You do not raise your lifestyle to impress. You raise your lethargy to master the pressure. The solidification of iridium, forging sub-zero monopolies. The liquid state is not the final destination. To reach absolute invulnerability and become the strange attractor, you must lower the temperature further to force the final phase transition, solidification. Liquid capital must be frozen into pure gravitational mass. What is solid capital on the ashboard? It is monopolies. It is hard assets, market infrastructures, automated extraction systems, and expropriated territory. The lethal operator takes financial fluid and injects it into the molds of his operative architecture. You submerge it in the liquid nitrogen of your long-term vision. You do not invest with the anxiety of a gambler. You deploy capital with the methodical cruelty of a general establishing lead military bases in enemy territory. By freezing money into solid assets, you remove it from the Egregore's thermal cycle. The matrix can no longer evaporate your wealth through inflation. You have forged sub-zero iridium blocks that warp space-time. The murder of financial respect, subjugating the price. To ensure the ice in your vaults never melts, you must eradicate the biomass's Pavlovian response to price tags. The slave evaluates the world by what it costs. They are scared of large numbers. They feel reverence for luxury or million-dollar investments. That reverence is hierarchical submission. It is a thermal confession. It is the confession that the number on paper has more density than the entity looking at it. Execute the murder of financial respect. In the mind of the creator, stabilized at 144,000 hertz, the difference between a dollar bill and $10 million is an optical illusion. Both are simply holographic records. You forbid yourself from altering your heart rate before numbers. Whether you sign for a coffee or an unfriendly takeover of a multinational, your thermal signature must be the same. Absolute zero. You do not ask if you can pay it. You apply aseptic indifference and only question if it expands your inertial gravity. The extinction of thermal risk. Corpse immunity. Matrix experts base their science on risk. They say to win fortunes, you must assume risks, enduring stress and fear. Subject risk theory to the higher physics incinerator. Risk is an exclusively thermal concept. It is the fear of combustion. You can only risk something if you are panicked about losing it. If you have a visceral fear of poverty, every investment will be contaminated with the quantum sweat of your terror. You will vibrate in the frequency of loss. The lethal operator is immune to risk because he has executed corpse immunity. You have already accepted the physical and financial disintegration of your avatar. You crossed the portal of poverty in the Black Mirror and realized bankruptcy does not kill you. Therefore, when you move colossal masses of capital, you do it with the dead pulse of an organism with nothing to protect. This gelida audacity makes you invulnerable. The material universe submits to the entity with no fear. The aesthetics of zero friction, repudiating the showcase. Once solid capital has forged your financial black hole, the matrix will try to inject heat through vanity. The system will push you to exhibit success. They will demand you buy status symbols so other insects can validate your hierarchy. Subject exhibitionism to the creator's lethargy. It is a pathetic action. Buying luxury to prove power is the attempt of a low-mass organism to appear dense. When you seek 3D applause, you let photonic light degenerate your capital. The nouveau riche ego is an intolerable voltage leak. The monarch instates zero-friction aesthetics. Your relationship with matter becomes purely utilitarian. If you acquire a high engineering vehicle, you do it to isolate your field from noise, not for admiration. You clothe your avatar with the dark, logoless armor of a predator that repudiates detection. Your wealth must be a nuclear sub under the ice, invisible, indetectable, armed with the capacity to annihilate. The gravitational suction effect, money devouring money. The most terrifying phenomenon of financial cryogenics occurs when the frozen core reaches critical mass. In particle physics, gravity is inherent to mass. When you have accumulated solid capital and murdered urgency, your core becomes a gravitational anomaly. The inertial suction effect is unleashed. It is no longer you who must order capital transfers. The crystallized wealth generates its own orbit. Frozen money acquires such atrocious density that it starts ripping liquid capital from the hands of weak, hot operators. Ecosystem resources are pushed by inertia toward your funnel. It is effortless accumulation. Orphaned capitals, terrified by economic thermal volatility, instinctively seek the refuge of your operative absolute zero. Money seeks cold to avoid evaporation. Money devours money through pure fluid physics. You watch this from your throne, without moving a finger, yawning at the ease of the ashboard. The extinction of the beggar, the cessation of worry. The climax of financial cryogenics is the total eradication of poverty software in your neural pathways. The slave, even when accumulating money, remains a beggar in his mind. They check menu prices and worry about holographic recessions. The lethal operator executes the extinction of the beggar. You cut the cord. You accept as a geological fact that poverty is thermodynamically impossible in your coordinates. Just as a fish does not worry about water, you stop worrying about capital flow. You assimilate it as the natural atmosphere of your sub-base frequency. Money stops being a topic in your internal dialogue. The sepulchral silence you installed over your fears, you now install over your bank accounts. You have frozen the economy. You have liquefied volatility. You have solidified the matrix into iridium ingots under your feet, and you have sat on that glacier to watch the pathetic combustion of the rest of the species. The master of the Ice Age. Look at yourself in the armored epicenter of your own immaterial monopoly, surrounded by the crystalline formations of incalculable, frozen wealth. You managed to suffocate the fiat paper scam. You understood that the slave's anxiety was the heat that evaporated financial gas, pushing abundance into the abyss. You mutilated boiling hand syndrome, refusing to dissipate your mass by burning capital on matrix props. You executed financial cryogenics. You lowered your thermostat to absolute zero, forcing quantum fluids of abundance to hit your lethargy and condense into a rain of constant liquidity. You forged iridium assets. You murdered respect for price and castrated financial risk, assuming the immunity of the corpse that does not fear 3D bankruptcy. You repudiated exhibitionism through zero-friction aesthetics, hiding your empire's tonnage in the darkest of trenches. Your core is so cold that ecosystem money commits suicide in your gravity. Chapter 5. Endothermic warfare, absorbing the enemy's fire, the symmetrical friction trap, the clash of hot engines. In the topography of the ashboard, conflict is the most efficient thermal collection tool of the parasitic system. The Egregore, the matrix managing scarcity, needs the biomass to fight. You have been programmed with the instinct for defense of honor, justice, and revenge. You are taught to return the blow with double force. They teach you the doctrine of symmetrical friction, fire against fire. Subject 3D warfare to zero-point optics. When a competitor tries to destroy your monopoly, they are projecting hot kinetic energy toward your coordinates. Their aggression is a flamethrower. If you become indignant and decide to counterattack, you ignite your own fire. What happens in systems physics when two massive fire sources collide? A catastrophic deflagration occurs. The temperature of the environment skyrockets. Both combustion engines overheat. The slave believes that by screaming louder or destroying with anger, he has won. The lethal operator audits the field and rules. Both have lost. By entering into rage and defending yourself with fire, you have burned your own reserves of inertial energy. You have dissipated your hyperdensity. You have abandoned the iridium throne to wallow in the boiling mud of insects. And the egregore, floating above the battlefield, feeds on the residual heat of your indignation. The nature of the endothermic reaction, devouring external kinetics. To maintain the integrity of operative absolute zero against direct aggression, the Homo quantum must alter the chemistry of his response. You must transmute symmetrical war into endothermic warfare. An exothermic reaction releases heat, the slave's attack. An endothermic reaction is the opposite. It absorbs thermal energy. It is a process that absorbs energy from its surroundings to sustain itself, causing the environment's temperature to plummet and freeze. This is the monarch's ultimate ballistic weapon. When the enemy's fire hits your ecosystem, You do not return the fire. You do not oppose a rigid shield, for that clash generates friction and heat. You become a thermodynamic black hole. You open the gates of your aseptic vacuum and absorb the attack. You receive the insult or the corporate siege and subject it immediately to the atmospheric pressure of your lethal apathy. By not reacting, the enemy's fire finds no fuel. Instead of burning you, the attack is devoured. The aggressor's heat is suffocated in the abyss of your indifference, and by absorbing their energy without returning it, the enemy's temperature drops violently. Literally, you steal their vital heat, leaving them exposed to the cosmic elements. You feed on their kinetic projection to strengthen the internal cold of your own core. Extirpation of 3D honor, the ego as flammable material. The greatest obstacle to executing endothermic warfare is the biological ego. The ego is highly flammable. It is composed of condensed human insecurity sprayed with the fuel of vanity. When you are attacked, the ego demands defense. The reptile howls. You cannot let them disrespect you. You have to show them who is the boss. Honor is a thermal contract invented by slaves to force each other to spend energy on useless jewels. A god has no human honor to defend, because honor implies that the biomass's opinion has structural value. If an insect insults you and you feel offended, you are a slave. You are confessing that the insect's opinion has the power to alter your basal temperature. You are lowering yourself to their hierarchy. The lethal operator executes the extirpation of the ego in combat. You replace honor with geometric arrogance. You understand the attack is just static noise from a frightened mammal. Since you have no ego to ignite, the attack passes through your hologram without touching your osmium core. You do not respond to the aggression, because responding would be to admit the aggressor exists in your same plane of reality. You remain unalterable, observing the flame of their hatred as a mere curiosity of the vacuum. Vacuum defense, letting the aggressor hit nothingness. To master the physics of endothermic combat, you must master the vacuum defense tactic. Imagine a 3D gladiator charging with all his brute force and fury against a steel wall. The clash is brutal. There is noise and destruction. Now imagine that same gladiator charging, but instead of a wall, he finds the edge of an infinite abyss. He throws the blow with all his kinetic mass, but finds no resistance. He hits the air. The inertia of his own attack, failing to find an object to break against, unbalances him and drags him forward. He plunges over the cliff, shattering against the rocks below by the weight of his own violence. The creator is that abyss. When the market attacks or an adversary tries to destroy you, you withdraw resistance. You apply tactical blindness to the conflict. You become immaterial to the aggression. The enemy expects you to defend yourself with fury. By finding a sepulchral silence, their kinetic energy has nowhere to crash. They fall by their own effort. Thermal fatigue syndrome, suffocating the will to fight. The aggressor's mammalian intellect is designed to operate in feedback loops. They attack, wait for your reaction, and use that reaction to plan their next move. It is a symmetrical dance. When you execute magnetic paralysis and apply absolute zero, you deny the aggressor the chemical feedback their brain desperately needs. This generates thermal fatigue syndrome in the enemy. At first, given your silence, the aggressor will think you are stunned. They will escalate the attack. They will scream louder and be crueler. They will try to force your temperature to rise. You maintain the quantum yawn. You look at them with the dead eyes of an abyssal predator. There is no panic in your pupils, no anger, just a psychopathic and aseptic lethargy. The aggressor's brain cannot process this asymmetry. The lack of response is interpreted as a terrifying cosmic anomaly. They begin to doubt. Paranoia settles in. They burn their energy trying to decipher your inscrutability. Their fire dies. They die of thermal suffocation, paralyzed by the terror instilled by an opponent whom it is impossible to make react. By not granting them the friction of a response, you have turned their own biology against them. Their internal furnace consumes itself in a vacuum where no echo exists to validate their existence. Expropriation of inertia, arming aggression in your favor. Endothermic warfare is not a philosophy of pacifism. Pacifism is the morality of cowards who fear combat. Endothermic warfare is the ultimate expression of ballistic cruelty, because you not only destroy the enemy, but you expropriate their energy to finance your own expansion. We call this the expropriation of inertia. Aggression directed toward you is a massive packet of concentrated energy. When you apply vacuum defense and absorb that heat without burning, that energy does not disappear. It transfers to your reactor. You use the enemy's impulse to accelerate the speed of your own 3D operations. You cannibalize their kinetic project. If a competitor spends millions on a smear campaign, they draw the entire market's attention to your coordinates. By maintaining iridium stasis and not responding, the market perceives the competitor's hysteria and your empire's solidity. The defamation becomes free advertising of your own unshakable hyperdensity. The competitor's clients, disgusted by the erratic heat and sweat of their own provider and fascinated by the magnetic cold you emanate, abandon the aggressor's ship. They are sucked into your sovereign gravity funnel. You destroyed your competitor using their money and their aggression while you remained bored on the throne. Silence as ballistic weaponry, the torture of non-response. For the endothermic suction effect to be lethal, the acoustic tool you must master is ballistic silence. It is not the passive-aggressive silence of the human who doesn't speak because he is offended. That silence is hot. It emits resentment. Ballistic silence is the geological silence of a mountain or a monolith. It is the muteness of an object that does not register the existence of the fly crashing against its rock. When under fire in the Matrix, you forbid yourself from issuing press releases to clarify the situation. You forbid yourself from responding to inflammatory emails. You forbid yourself from explaining anything to parasites. You impose an absolute acoustic quarantine on the crisis. Silence is the most destructive psychological weapon because the human projects his worst fears into the vacuum. If you say nothing, the aggressor fills that silence with their own terrors. They convince themselves you are preparing an apocalyptic counterattack. In their panic to defend against an attack that does not exist, they commit massive errors that fracture their own structure. Your muteness is the anvil upon which the enemy's sanity is shattered by hammers of paranoia. You do not need to speak to win. Your absence of words is a pressure that crushes their internal coherence. False fire baptism, immunity to extortion. Aggressors often use false fire to subject operators, threats of reputational destruction or emotional blackmail. The slave yields out of fear. The hyperdense creator uses this as an endothermic baptism. When threatened with personal apocalypse, you apply the yawn. You look the aggressor in their holographic eyes. Do it. Destroy my reputation. Set fire to the ashboard. My core is anchored at 144,000 hertz. I will survive the fire, walk on the ashes, and rebuild my empire tomorrow morning. You cannot extort me because I have no panic about losing matrix props. When the aggressor understands you don't care about 3D destruction, their power dies. The Matrix can only control that which fears being destroyed. By demonstrating corpse immunity, the fact that you already operated amnesia and have no attachments, the aggressor's weapon becomes useless. The false fire goes out by pure futility. You are unbribable because you are already detached from the result. Assimilation of debris, post-conflict cannibalism. The culminating phase of endothermic warfare occurs when the enemy's temperature has fallen below their survival threshold. Their attack has vanished. They have suffocated in the paranoia of your silence. They have spent all their capital and kinetic friction crashing against the perimeter ice wall of your indifference. The enemy collapses. Their corporate or social structure fractures into 1,000 pieces. It is in this moment of absolute stillness that the lethal operator rises. But not to celebrate. Celebration is euphoria, and euphoria would melt your absolute zero. You rise with the psychopathic lethargy of orthopedic action. You walk over the frozen battlefield and execute the assimilation of debris. You cannibalize the remains of the enemy's infrastructure. You acquire their liquidated assets at the price of ash. You absorb their market share. You swallow the pieces of the aggressor without chewing and without pity, building your own walls. There is no mercy in fluid physics. The greater mass attracts the lesser. The enemy wanted to heat you with their hatred, and their thermodynamic punishment is to be frozen, crushed, and used as bricks for the monarch's zero-friction hallway. Their failure is the fuel that stabilizes the expansion of your singular monopoly. Eradication of defensive mode, the pure state of hyperdensity. The assimilation of endothermic warfare produces a final mutation, the total eradication of defensive mode, the human lives in a constant state of guard. This defensive paranoia consumes astronomical voltage and keeps the biological furnace lukewarm. When you prove your absolute zero devours any attack, you stop defending. You lose the reflex to protect yourself. You become a quantum anomaly walking naked through the battlefield without shields, because you know the most impenetrable armor is the absence of flammable ego. You no longer anticipate attacks, you simply exist in such density that any projectile is crushed by your own gravity. Combat ceases to be a struggle for survival and becomes a routine, aseptic, and boring mechanism through which the 3D universe delivers the mass of the weak to feed your singularity. You are the immovable point that devours the heat of the world. Aggression is no longer a threat. It is a nutrient for your Gelida expansion. The fire devourer. Look at yourself in the soundless epicenter of the frozen crater, surrounded by the thermal corpses of the insects who mistook your immobility for weakness. You managed to suffocate the symmetrical friction trap. You understood that returning the blow with hatred was thermodynamic suicide to heat the matrix with your blood. You mutilated human honor, assuming dignity is the cheap fuel of slaves needing validation. You executed vacuum defense. You let enemy flamethrowers hit immaterial nothingness, watching with the quantum yawn as they plunged over the cliff of their own violence. You murdered their will through thermal fatigue syndrome. You were not a peaceful martyr, you were an endothermic black hole. You expropriated their inertia. You armed their aggression in your favor, turning enemy energy into the engine of your own gravitational funnel. You walked through their false fire and devoured debris. Chapter 6. Extirpation of Thermal Parasites, the Exile of the Stoves. The Biology of Thermal Vampirism, Anatomy of the Host. To govern the ice age that you have established in your consciousness, the lethal operator must master the perimeter security of his ecosystem. The ashboard is not an inert vacuum, it is infested with biomass. In systems physics, human biomass that has not stabilized its core in absolute zero operates under a model of thermal parasitism. Subject your social circle to zero-point optics. Observe your relatives, your supposed friends, and the partners orbiting your carbon avatar. The vast majority of them are defective organisms. They lack the inertial density to collapse their own reality. They live submerged in drama, burning their cellular battery in useless complaints. To avoid dying of hypothermia in the abyss of their insignificance, they desperately need an external heat source. They need a stove. They need to parasitize the reactor of a superior organism. You, forging thermal tyranny, are the primary target. The thermal parasite detects that you have energy, gravity, and a building monopoly. Their survival instinct forces them to approach you, not to learn to be ice gods, but to sink their fangs into your nervous system and demand that you raise your temperature, that you feel empathy, pity, or anger to warm them up. If you allow these insects to adhere to your chassis, your absolute zero will fracture and your empire melt. Taxonomy of the chaos stoves, identifying the infiltrator. To execute the extirpation, you must first diagnose the infection. Thermal parasites do not present themselves as enemies, they appear disguised as victims or loved ones. They are what we call chaos stoves. They radiate static noise and demand that you process their emotional trash. Audit your perimeter and classify the stoves. They always have a crisis. They seek advice, but really want you to feel pity, which is a direct injection of your vital heat into their empty veins. 2. The drama incendiary. This specimen does not tolerate peace. They bring gossip to ignite your amygdala and make you react. The anchor of nostalgia, usually disguised as biological family. They are organisms stuck in the past who demand loyalty. If they see you cooling down and becoming hyperdense, they accuse you of having changed, trying to inject thermal guilt so you return to being the docile slave they can control. All seek to dissipate your gravity. The toxic empathy contract, the human loyalty scam. The anchoring mechanism the parasite uses to adhere to your hull is a social construct. Toxic empathy. The Matrix has indoctrinated you with the lie that you must be there for your people in good times and bad. They convinced you that loyalty consists of sinking with the ship of failures because you share a genetic code or history. Apply the obsidian guillotine to this contract. In the quantum physics of manifestation, loyalty toward chaos is treason toward the singularity. If you are operating an iridium reactor bathed in liquid nitrogen, and a parasite demands attention for irrelevant drama, yielding to that demand is committing thermodynamic sabotage. Three-dimensional empathy is the act of matching your temperature to an inferior organism so they do not feel humbled by your greatness. When you put yourself in their shoes, you are putting your feet in the oven. You are burning out of courtesy. The lethal operator understands that the only valid loyalty is to absolute zero. The savior complex, the false messiah's leak. A variant of thermal self-sabotage is the savior complex. When your money multiplies and your power expands, the mammalian ego feels the urge to awaken others. You look at the parasites and decide to save them. You try to teach them how to cool their reactors, give them money, and explain how the matrix works. The hyperdense creator prohibits this ballistic stupidity. Attempting to save the biomass is the suicide of the false messiah. Parasites do not want to be saved. They do not want the terrifying responsibility of governing zero friction. They want to remain victims because it requires no mass and guarantees scraps of pity. When you try to educate them, you apply kinetic friction. They argue and resist. In that discussion, your temperature rises. You have fallen into the trap. The parasite has achieved exactly what it wanted. It made you sweat. The monarch does not save insects. He allows weak organisms to calcine in their own entropy. The aseptic extirpation protocol, surgery without anesthesia. To clean your empire's perimeter, you must execute the aseptic extirpation protocol. It is not a gradual distancing. It is a military-grade surgical amputation. The slave tries to distance from toxic people with thermal noise. They have closure talks or send dramatic messages. All this noise is thermal dissipation. It is heat. The lethal operator executes the extirpation without emitting a single syllable. You apply the absolute zero scalpel. Simply from 1 millisecond to another, you close the valve. You stop responding to the chaos stove's emergencies. You ignore calls. You become unreachable, opaque, and inscrutable. There are no discussions because you do not recognize the parasite as a valid interlocutor in your hierarchy. Explaining to an insect why you will crush it is giving it kinetic energy. The extirpation must be so cold and mechanical that the parasite doesn't even understand what happened. You generate a pressure vacuum that expels them. Acoustic quarantine, the vampire's hunger. When you execute aseptic extirpation, the parasite will not surrender immediately. Their survival depends on your heat. They will enter thermal attack mode. They will accuse you of being a narcissist or a heartless traitor. They will throw poisoned darts at your reputation using emotional blackmail. You forgot your origins. You become an anechoic chamber. You receive the insults and let them hit the ice wall of your indifference. You do not block the noise by defending yourself. You absorb and neutralize it with the monarch's yawn. You must watch their desperation with coldness. The thermal vampire feeds on your responses. If you get angry, it eats. If you apologize, it feasts. But if you maintain operative absolute zero and emit no biological response, the vampire starves. It crashes against a smooth iridium wall, finding no crack to suck your energy. Acoustic quarantine kills them by tactical starvation. Repudiation of the biological tribe, the lone wolf heresy. Systematic extirpation will lead you to face the deepest taboo, fear of loneliness. The Egregore has inserted into the DNA of the biomass the terror of being exiled. In 3D prehistory, a human alone was a dead human. Therefore, the brain terrifies you into tolerating parasites just to feel that you belong to a group. Homo quantum, stabilized at 144,000 Hz, repudiates the biological tribe. Thermal tyranny requires you to assimilate a truth. Hyperdensity is inherently lonely. A massive black hole does not orbit in a group to feel validated. It swallows everything around it. It rules matter through the dictatorship of its gravity. You must murder the gregarious instinct. You must learn to love the abyssal cold of your own exclusive company. When you discard the fear of loneliness, the Matrix loses its most powerful blackmail tool. They can no longer threaten abandonment because you have already abandoned the entire species. You feed on your own vacuum. Sterilization of the perimeter, the creator's clean room. As you amputate parasites, your ecosystem will experience a brutal drop in ambient temperature. By eliminating chaos stoves, static noise disappears. Military-grade silence is established. You have created the creator's clean room. In microchip manufacturing, construction occurs in sterilized, temperature-controlled rooms. Your mind and physical environment must operate under this same sterilization protocol. By exiling emotional vampires, you free up gigawatts of quantum RAM previously wasted on their problems. The immaterial clarity you reach in this aseptic isolation is terrifying. Your mandates travel the unified field without distortion. You issue the order to collapse a market, and it materializes at an obscene speed because no parasite is injecting doubt or pessimism into your line of code. Sterilization is not an act of cruelty. It is industrial maintenance on the machinery of your own omnipotence. You are protecting the integrity of your ballistic calculations. The Glacier endurance test, withstanding the siege of guilt. Exiling stoves is not a one-time event. The Matrix will try to re-inject parasites to measure your glacier's integrity. It will execute the thermal resistance test. Suddenly, an extirpated relative will reappear with a terminal illness, pleading for help. Or an old friend will appeal to nostalgia exactly when you close a deal. The biological reptile will feel the sting of guilt. Guilt is the Egregore's bacteriological weapon. The lethal operator assumes the posture of the iridium machine. You observe the tragedy of the holographic parasite and apply the quantum yawn. You forbid yourself from opening the door. You understand that pity is a fallacy. If the parasite suffers ruin, it is the direct thermodynamic consequence of their inability to govern internal friction. Their suffering is the math of their biological stupidity. If you open the door and give your capital or empathy, you are not solving their problem. You are just paying the entropy tax and financing defeat. The zero-degree circle, architecture of hyperdense alliances. If the monarch has extirpated parasites and repudiated the tribe, is there any association that is not a thermal leak? Does the lethal operator make alliances? Yes, but he forges the zero-degree circle. It is the exclusive interaction between operators who have reached thermal tyranny. They operate as stabilized black holes. When two zero-friction entities associate, they do not exchange emotional heat. They do not tell each other their problems. They do not demand loyalty based on guilt, because neither has a biological ego to inflame. Their interaction is purely mathematical, ballistic, and aseptic. It is the fusion of two massive fields. This is the only social interaction allowed by superior thermodynamics, inert synergy. You work with tactical allies with the same coldness as connecting two computer processors to increase calculation capacity. Once the target is devoured, the alliance dissolves without drama. Each black hole returns to its absolute isolation. The king in the vault of winter. Look at yourself in the sterilized center of your immaterial perimeter, surrounded by miles of unassailable ice, having executed thermal genocide upon the affections that anchored you to weakness. You managed to suffocate the human empathy scam. You understood thermal parasitism is the tactic of insects seeking to steal mass. You mutilated the chaos stoves, exiling the martyr and the drama incendiary without the privilege of an explanation. You operated the absolute zero scalpel to amputate relatives through the soundless stroke of silent suffocation. You endured acoustic quarantine, absorbing insults until the vampire disintegrated against your wall. You gutted the savior complex, accepting that rescuing biomass is a pathetic dissipation of voltage. You eradicated the tribe instinct, embracing the crushing loneliness of pure osmium, and endured the Glacier endurance test by extirpating the biological weapon of guilt. Chapter 7. The Crystal Prison, Freezing the Time Variable. The Slaughterhouse Stopwatch, the Tyranny of Linear Time. The oldest, most omnipresent, and devastating control architecture of the Egregore is not money or fear. It is the illusion of linear time. The 3D parasitic system has locked the biomass into a chronological slaughterhouse. From the moment the carbon avatar is ejected onto the ashboard, a clock is tied to its wrist and the countdown virus is injected. Humanity is taught that time is a mighty river flowing in one direction and that it is drying up. They tell you that time is money, that you are running out of time, that you must hurry to reach your goals before getting old. Subject this philosophy to the scalpel of the lethal operator. In quantum physics, linear time is a persistent hallucination. It is a malleable variable that depends exclusively on the gravity and speed of the observer. But the slave does not observe, the slave flees. The reptile in your brain lives terrified by the stopwatch. They feel the future is a predator chasing them. This perception of time as a threat generates a state of perpetual biological emergency. The slave burns in the furnace of his own calendar. Haste is the fire in which mediocrity calcines its own foundations. If you operate your empire by looking at the matrix clock, you are accepting that time has a higher thermodynamic hierarchy than your consciousness. You are confessing that you are finite, perishable, and weak. Thermodynamics of haste, the anxious one's friction. To master the time variable, you must first diagnose the ballistic consequences of urgency. What happens in the electromagnetic field when a mammal is in a hurry? Haste is the kinetic manifestation of the terror of lack. When you hurry to close a deal or despair because a capital transfer is delayed, you inject massive friction. Your basal temperature skyrockets. In the mechanics of immaterial fluids, haste destroys the aerodynamics of your collapse. Imagine a hyperdense vehicle trying to cross the atmosphere. If it maintains a cold and calculated trajectory, zero friction, it pierces the air resistance like a laser. But if the vehicle begins to shake, it fails. If it starts to agitate, change direction erratically, and accelerate with desperation, haste, it generates massive turbulence. Atmospheric friction overheats it into a fireball, disintegrating it before it hits the ground. The ashboard punishes haste with asset evaporation. When you act with urgency, you tell matter that you are desperate. 3D matter, which is inherently lazy and cold, feels repulsion for the heat of your desperation. If you pursue $1 million by running and checking the clock, the $1 million will accelerate to maintain distance because your heat is repulsive. Urgency does not accelerate success. Urgency only accelerates your entropy. The static block theory, the murder of tomorrow. The creator operating at the sub-base frequency of 144,000 Hertz executes a geometric transmutation in his perception of the universe. You must abandon the flowing river model and adopt the space-time block theory, the block universe. In this physical perspective, past, present, and future exist simultaneously as one single block. They exist as an immense static and immovable crystal block. Time does not pass. It is you, the lower consciousness, who moves through the coordinates of that crystalline block. The lethal operator uses this theory to execute the murder of tomorrow. If the future already exists as a hyperdensity coordinate, anxiety is absurd. You do not have to build the empire tomorrow. The empire is already crystallized in a specific latitude of the matrix. Your only operative function is to draw that coordinate toward your core through the gravitational attraction of your immobility. By murdering the concept of tomorrow, you suffocate anxiety. You stop chasing. I am in no hurry to reach the future, because the future is simply an osmium mold that has already been filled with my mandate. I do not run toward the goal. I sit in the vacuum and compel the space-time coordinate to move toward my boots. This quantum pride paralyzes the biological clock. You excise the need to monitor days. Gravitational time dilation. The black hole is not in a hurry. Higher physics establishes that time does not pass at the same speed for all observers. According to relativity, the greater the gravitational mass, the slower relative time passes. At the edge of a supermassive black hole, the event horizon, time from an external perspective seems to stop almost completely. This is the monarch's inertial biology. The slave, lacking mass, lives in an accelerated time. Their days fly by, full of hysteria and panic. They age quickly, crushed by the friction of their own lightness. You, having forged the osmium magnet and stabilized at operative absolute zero, become a gravitational anomaly. You are so immensely heavy at an immaterial level that linear time warps around you. You execute time dilation. The lethal operator is not in a hurry because he inhabits a terrifying tactical slowness. You watch your competitors running back and forth, stressed, burning their capital. You watch them in slow motion. You move with the heaviness of a tectonic plate. When you operate without haste, you do not make friction errors. You make decisions with a psychopathic lethargy that terrifies the biomass. Your slowness is not laziness, it is the visual confirmation of your omnipotence. Only servants run. The king walks with a slow weight. The architecture of the crystal prison, locking the ecosystem. When linear time has been bent and haste suffocated, you must install your empire within the structure that names this chapter, the crystal prison. It is a cryogenic stasis technology. The 3D world is organic, corrosive, and chaotic. Corporations rust, fortunes are eaten by inflation, and relationships rot. Time degrades all. The creator refuses to subject his assets to the elements of human entropy. Once the financial monopoly or territorial power has crossed your half-open door, you isolate that ecosystem. You lock it in a crystal vault at 0 degrees Kelvin. You freeze the time variable over your possessions to protect their integrity. You forbid yourself from subjecting your assets to market stress. You do not take reactionary decisions based on the news of the day. If the Matrix projects a holographic economic recession, slaves panic and sell. The lethal operator observes the recession from his crystal prison and yawns. He does not alter a single line of code. Cryogenic maturation, the inert growth of capital. You keep your assets locked in the eternal ice of your initial strategy. Your empire becomes inert to the passage of years because you have expelled the oxygen of anxiety. In the absolute vacuum of the crystal, your monopolies are protected from biological aging. The reptile will argue, If you freeze your empire, you will stagnate. In monopoly collapse physics, the most violent growth occurs beneath the surface, in absolute darkness and gelida temperatures. We catalog this as cryogenic maturation. Imagine the formation of a diamond in the Earth's depths or a crystal stalactite. They do not grow by fire or light. They grow by the sustained application of monumental pressure throughout a time frozen in stasis. When you lock your assets in the crystal prison and apply tactical blindness, you forget them. You do not monitor them. You generate massive immaterial pressure. Capital grows by zero friction. Your investments and networks of power mature in the dark, without rust, without wear, and without leaks. They condense and become harder and more lethal. When you finally decide to look at your vault after a period of stasis, you discover maturation has multiplied your hyperdensity exponentially, far beyond an anxious slave's trading. The deadline fallacy, the calendar blackmail. The favorite torture instrument of the corporate and social matrix is the deadline. The mammal is programmed to obey the calendar. They tell you that you must be a millionaire by 30, pay the debt by Friday, or lose the chance. The deadline is a heat weapon designed to force you to sweat and make suboptimal decisions. The lethal operator applies the obsidian guillotine to the human calendar. You execute the absolute repudiation of deadlines dictated by the ecosystem. You have no deadlines because you are not an employee of the ashboard, you are the architect of the simulator. If the Matrix puts a gun to your head with an ultimatum, you relax. You lean back on the iridium throne, apply ballistic silence, and let midnight pass. You let their clock crash against your ice wall. What does the monarch discover when he dares to ignore temporal blackmail? He discovers that deadlines are paper illusions. When midnight arrives and you have not yielded, the material universe panics. Their bluff collapses. Then they call you the next day, apologizing and extending the time, bowing before the tyranny of your apathy. The Matrix always surrenders its calendars before the organism that proves it is not afraid of the passing hours. You dictate the pace of the negotiation by the mere weight of your gelida indifference. The exile of nostalgia, mutilating yesterday's corpse. The crystal prison not only suffocates anxiety about the future, it also demands the relentless extermination of the past. The biomass spends 50% of its immaterial voltage on a thermal disease called nostalgia. They look back. They cry over mistakes. They regret investments not made or relationships lost. Nostalgia is quantum necrophilia. It is the act of lying with dead photons. In zero-point relativity, the past is not a place you can return to. It is the toxic residue of the Matrix's exhaust pipe. Every millisecond you spend lamenting yesterday is a direct blood transfusion from your current core toward a corpse that cannot be revived. The Homo Quantum executes the exile of nostalgia. You forbid yourself from looking through the 3D rearview mirror. There is no regret because regret requires moral heat. If you lost a fortune or made a rookie mistake, you analyze it with mathematical sterility, extract the structural data, and then incinerate it. In the crystal prison, only the dictatorship of the present millisecond exists. By amputating the past, you deny the Matrix the possibility of using old failures as emotional blackmail to destabilize your current immobility. You are a god without a biography, and a being without a past cannot be extorted or mentally controlled. Relative clock torture, suffocating the competition. When you inhabit the crystal prison and time dilation becomes your basal state, you develop an atrocious offensive capability, relative clock torture. You can use your temporal immobility as a siege weapon against your enemies. In any conflict, the side that is in a hurry is always the side that loses. Haste is the rope. Haste is the rope the slave ties around his neck. If an enemy attacks you, their nervous system expects you to respond in their same accelerated time frame. You respond by introducing the conflict into your crystal prison. You do not answer lawsuits in the expected time. You delay negotiations. You freeze emails for weeks. You impose a tactical, bureaucratic, and suffocating slowness on the process. The aggressor, operating as a hot combustion engine, cannot stand the weight. The delay makes them paranoid. They burn millions trying to force you to move, while you simply watch them bleed against the ice block of your inaction. Your slowness is a pit. It is a gravitational pit that sucks their patience and their capital. They end up surrendering and offering you total capitulation, not because you beat them in a debate, but because they could not endure the agony of fighting against a geological glacier that refuses to register the passage of time. You outlast their fever, a septic eternity governing outside of time. The climax of temporal assimilation is the entry into aseptic eternity. It is not the poetic concept of living forever. It is the thermodynamic state of governing outside the laws of time. It is the cellular understanding that your consciousness is not a carbon entity subject to entropy's cellular oxidation. It is timeless mass. When you consolidate the crystal prison, the fear of biological death, humanity's greatest source of haste, evaporates. The biomass runs because they know their body will rot. They want a legacy. That is the slave's supreme heat. You decouple from your own avatar. You treat your body like a rental vehicle you will use. You use it until its parts melt. But your iridium operative core, your sub-base frequency, does not age. By losing the fear of expiration, your empire becomes thermodynamically immortal. You plan expansions with horizons of decades, operating with the terrifying patience of a cosmic force. You have no closing bell to obey. This absence of existential haste endows you with a gravity so crushing that mortals trying to compete with you feel like insects challenging a mountain range. You occupy the entire spectrum of time because you have ceased to be its victim. You have become the static container in which time itself is forced to stop and settle. The master of frozen coordinates. Look at yourself in the sterilized center of your crystal prison, surrounded by blocks of solid ice where your empires and victories rest in perfect maturation. You managed to suffocate the illusion of time's river. You understood haste is the fire of the mediocre, the kinetic friction that melts success before it crosses the threshold. You mutilated the slave's stopwatch, assuming the static block theory and murdering anxiety for tomorrow through the unbribable certainty that the coordinate of the future already belongs to you. You executed gravitational time dilation. You became an immobilized black hole, watching the competition's tachycardia with lethargy. You locked the ecosystem in operative absolute zero, allowing hyperdensity to mature in darkness, safe from market oxidation and human entropy. You repudiated deadline blackmail, proving the matrix surrenders calendars to the organism that is not afraid to let midnight pass. You exiled nostalgia, incinerating yesterday's corpses, and you turned your slowness into a siege weapon, suffocating aggressors through relative clock torture, letting them die of thermal fatigue against the unbreakable walls of your aseptic eternity. You are the immovable architect of a reality that no longer pulses. You are the ice that dictates the shape of the world. Chapter 8. The Veto on Verbal Friction, the Dictatorship of Acoustic Ice, the Hemorrhage of the Vocal Cords, the Noise of the Slave. In the Egregore's control architecture, the parasitic system has provided the biomass with a lethal escape valve to ensure they never accumulate the atmospheric pressure necessary to collapse reality. Human language. The slave has been indoctrinated to adore communication. They tell you that you must express your feelings and debate your ideas. They say transparency is a virtue. The lethal operator subjects the speech apparatus to zero-point optics. In systems thermodynamics, sound is a mechanical wave that propagates through a medium, generating vibration and friction. When you speak, your vocal cords vibrate, agitating the oxygen molecules around you. You emit heat. For the inferior biomass, speaking is a desperate need because they cannot stand the pressure of their own internal vacuum. When a slave feels fear or joy, emotional voltage builds up. Lacking osmium shielding to contain that hyperdensity, the pressure threatens to burst them. They talk to release the pressure and dissipate heat. The hyperdense creator understands that relief is the slave's euphemism for the hemorrhage of their own gravity. Every time you open your mouth to discharge emotional tension, you are bleeding kinetic energy. You are giving away your mass to the ashboard. Noise is humanity's most constant thermal leak, draining your potential. Acoustic convection, dissipating voltage into the void. To establish thermal tyranny over your verbal apparatus, you must understand heat transfer by convection. Convection is the transport of heat via the movement of a fluid. When you house a colossal mandate in your mind, the conquest of a market or the destruction of a rival, that idea has a very high temperature in its formation phase. It is quantum magma. If you close your lips, you seal the boiler. The magma condenses and crystallizes into the hyperdensity that will warp matter. But if you commit the tactical suicide of talking about that mandate, telling friends or partners, you open the hatch. You allow acoustic convection. The heat of your goal escapes. The heat escapes through your words, warming the air and infecting the ears of the biomass. Upon finishing speaking, you feel satisfied because your mammalian brain has drugged you with dopamine, making you believe that by merely verbalizing it, you have achieved it. But in the immaterial plane, your boiler is now empty. The material universe does not obey those who talk about their empires. It obeys those who sustain the soundless pressure of their secrets until the empire has no choice but to materialize to relieve the tension of the silence. You must contain the expansion until the pressure itself forces the 3D world to yield to your will. The veto on justification, the biomass tribunal. The most humiliating form of verbal friction is self-justification. The slave lives terrified of the tribe's judgment. When the slave makes a decision that alters the status quo, quitting a job or abandoning a chaos stove, they feel the compulsive need to explain why they did it. Subject justification to hierarchical dissection. What is a justification? It is the legal act by which a subordinate presents arguments to a superior for approval. When you justify yourself to the ecosystem, you are building a tribunal with your own hands and appointing insects as your judges. You grant them the thermodynamic authority to evaluate your sovereign mandate. The lethal operator executes the absolute veto on justification. You establish the dictatorship of acoustic ice. When you execute a maneuver and the biomass demands an explanation, you respond with the muteness of iridium. You do not argue. You do not offer logical motives. You do not try to make them understand. I refuse to dissipate a single erg of my thermal energy, translating superior physics into the dialect of beggars. By refusing to explain yourself, you leave the ecosystem in a vacuum. The parasite suffocates in your silence, having no lever of control. The murder of debate, the symmetry of fools. In the 3D matrix, debate is glorified as an exercise of intelligence. The learned biomass adores arguing. They believe the one with the best arguments wins the war. The Homo quantum, stabilized at absolute zero, murders debate. Debate is the perfect trap of symmetrical friction. To debate, you must descend to their level. You must accept their premises to attack them. You must spend energy listening to their stupidity and formulating a counterattack. It is a heat exchange where both combustion engines wear out. The monarch does not debate with his subjects. A black hole does not argue with an asteroid. It simply exerts its gravity. If a competitor or a parasite tries to drag you into a debate, you apply tactical blindness and selective deafness. You forbid yourself from engaging in their game of verbal friction. You watch them move their mouths, hearing the buzz like a fly against armored glass, and you deny them your voice. You remain a heavy monolith. The refusal to debate is a thermodynamic victory. By not granting words to your opponent, you deprive them of the raw material they need to sustain their attack. The enemy is left fighting their own shadow, consuming themselves in the fire of their frustration, while you remain unalterable, conserving your inertial density. The leak of future plans, the phonetic abortion. The most sacred ballistic rule of thermal tyranny states that you must never announce a mandate before its total collapse into 3D reality. The biomass suffers from phonetic incontinence. They announce projects before laying the first brick. They do it to receive anticipated applause and drug themselves with social validation. This act is phonetic abortion. When you verbalize a future plan, you take the probability wave out of the darkroom. You expose it to the light and the Egregore's scrutiny. The matrix is plagued by thermal envy and skepticism. When you share your vision with low-mass organisms, their cynicism and doubt hit your frequency. Worse, by announcing it, you give your enemies the exact coordinates of your attack. You hand over your tactical map. The lethal operator seals his lips with osmium welding. Absolutely no one in your perimeter should know what you are about to collapse. You inhabit the shadows of paramilitary secrecy until the end. Your empire is not announced with trumpets. It manifests with the sudden brutality of a tectonic bomb. When the outside world finally finds out, it must be because the work is done and the capital is in your vaults. Surprise is the predator's weapon. The announcement is the warning of the prey asking for permission to attack. The torture of tactical silence, suffocating the interrogator. Silence, when wielded by an operator at absolute zero, ceases to be an absence of sound and becomes a heavy, sharp object. You enter the dimension of tactical silence. The human brain is programmed to loathe acoustic vacuums. When an awkward silence occurs, the biomass panics and feels the obligation to fill it with noise. In high-level negotiations or social extortions, tactical silence is your siege weapon. You sit at the table. The adversary makes a demand or a threat. The slave would respond immediately out of fear. The Homo quantum receives the sentence, assimilates it, stares with psychopathic lethargy, and says absolutely nothing. You let 3 seconds pass, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. The silence becomes so dense that the barometric pressure of the room seems to crush the adversary's lungs. The enemy, terrified by your lack of reaction and suffocated by acoustic ice, will begin to talk. In their panic, they will negotiate against themselves to fill the gap. They will lower their price and reveal insecurities. They will give you the keys to their castle, just so you emit a sound that confirms you are still human. You have won the combat without wasting a single calorie. Your silence acts as a physical weight that extracts concessions from the weak who cannot bear the soundless void. The irreversible mandate, the word as a scalpel. If the operator vetoes justification, murders debate, and tortures through silence, what is the voice for? In the architecture of acoustic ice, the voice is transmuted into the irreversible mandate. The word becomes a laser scalpel. You only open your mouth when you are going to physically alter the structure of the universe. You do not use your voice for opinions, as opinions are worthless thermal flatulence. You do not use your voice to suggest, as suggestion is the tool of the subordinate. You use your voice uniquely and exclusively to dictate. When the monarch finally breaks his silence, the weight of his words must be atrocious. You emit directives that are short, dry, and devoid of any trace of emotion. The contract is signed today. The price is this. The employee is fired. There are no exclamation marks in your tone. It is the mechanical transmission of a programming code. Because you stay in silence, when you speak, it has tons of pressure. The magnetism of the inscrutable, the gravitational mystery. The secondary consequence of eradicating verbal friction is the generation of the magnetism of the inscrutable. Human biomass is an open book. They vomit their past, traumas, and dreams on social media. They are transparent. In power physics, absolute transparency equals zero value. What is exposed to light loses gravity. By installing the verbal veto, you become inscrutable. No one knows what you are thinking. No one knows your weaknesses because you never complain. No one knows your limits because you never boast. You become a black obsidian monolith. Human nature is terrified and fascinated simultaneously by the unknown vacuum. By not being able to read you, the environment projects superhuman qualities onto you. They will believe you are infinitely more dangerous and powerful than your 3D resources suggest. Silence grants you a hyper-density camouflage. Competitors will not attack because they don't know your arsenal. You have armored your empire. The iridium diet, the fasting of words. For the carbon biological body to assimilate this acoustic tyranny, it must undergo martial training. You must establish the iridium diet, a radical fast of words in your 3D life. The slave cannot stand being quiet. Test the limit of your hardware. Spend 48 hours or a week reducing verbal output to the minimum. Zero trivial conversations. Zero jokes to please the biomass. Zero comments on the weather. Feel the reptile brain enter withdrawal. You will feel the physical urge in the throat to speak, to be noticed, to prove you exist. Swallow that impulse. Suffocate the need. By forcing the fast, you discover your wasted thermal energy. As the fast solidifies, that energy returns to your core. You feel heavier, more centered, and more lethal. The iridium diet teaches you that you do not need to emit sound waves for the universe to recognize your presence. Your gravity is enough to warp the room. You become a presence that is felt rather than heard. The black hole resonance, absorbing the world's sound. The supreme stage of acoustic ice is the transformation of your sensory apparatus into the black hole resonance. You do not just stop emitting verbal friction, you change how you interact with the noise others throw at you. The ashboard is deafening. The slave listens to it all, and the noise causes panic in his skull. The lethal operator has no walls in his mind for sound to bounce. He has an absorbing abyss. When the world screams or implores, you do not oppose resistance. You let the mechanical wave of the matrix's noise enter your perimeter and fall into the event horizon of your infinite apathy. The sound enters but never leaves. There is no echo, no response. You absorb insults and market crises with the same psychopathic lethargy. The material universe screams into the void, trying to find a bottom that does not exist. By hitting the infinity of your silence, the noise dies frozen. You have made the silence of your core more crushing than collective hysteria. The mute monarch. Look at yourself in the sterilized epicenter of your immaterial anechoic chamber, having castrated the most pathetic biological need of your carbon container. You managed to suffocate the hemorrhage of the vocal cords. You understood that talking is dissipating voltage into the void, and that convection was an invisible thief. Convection was stealing the gravitational mass needed to collapse miracles. You mutilated the need to justify yourself, destroying the biomass tribunal. You executed the murder of debate, assuming that arguing with mud is to get dirty with symmetrical friction. You repudiated phonetic abortion, sealing your plans in the dark. You installed the torture of tactical silence, using aseptic muteness to suffocate interrogators. You transmuted your biological voice into the irreversible mandate, the laser scalpel that only cuts space-time when the decision admits no appeal. You entrenched yourself in the magnetism of the inscrutable. Chapter 9. The Matrix's thermal collapse, the breaking of the simulator, the thermostat's agony, the Egregore's desperation. You have crossed the biomass purgatory. You refused to push the door, suffocated your voice through acoustic ice, embargoed the result, and froze your capital flow. You have installed a 0-degree Kelvin black hole at the exact center of a simulation that survives exclusively by feeding on fire, panic, and mammal sweat. The 3D matrix, the Egregore, faces an apocalyptic anomaly. The parasitic system has no creative intelligence. It is a thermal survival algorithm. When its sensors detect that your carbon avatar has stopped emitting friction and that your immaterial gravity is warping the market, the ecosystem executes its final defense protocol. It attempts to restart your biological furnace, but its conventional weapons are exhausted. The false alarm failed because of tactical blindness. Time blackmail failed because of the crystal prison. The Egregore, cornered by your immobility, enters computer panic. It injects a monstrous atmospheric overpressure to force a reaction. The BIOS configuration, the immaterial remote ignition. To survive this overload without blowing your fuses, you must abandon reality's graphical interface and descend to the universe's machine level. You must access the cosmos BIOS. The slave hits the keyboard of reality. They push physical buttons and work more hours. They try to turn on success by pressing the carbon casing button. The lethal operator understands that matter does not move by touching it. You execute the remote ignition configuration. In complex systems architecture, there is a protocol called wake on LAN. It allows an administrator to send a magic packet of data, so a cold computer comes to life instantly without physical contact. You configure quantum wake on LAN in your own psyche. You do not go out to turn on the empire by fighting the market. You retreat to the darkest corner of your ecosystem. You enter the ashboard's BIOS. From absolute stasis, you send the hyper-density packet, the pure 144,000 Hz frequency, through the unified field. The material universe, receiving this packet encrypted with zero-point authority, is forced to start its engines and materialize the booty while the monarch hasn't even stood up. It is the triumph of remote programming over manual effort. You have hacked existence's motherboard. The matrix is now your terminal, and you are the root. Acoustic treatment of the abyss. Suffocating chaos reverberation. When the matrix receives this remote ignition but tries to resist due to old code friction, a deafening structural noise is generated. The Egregore will try to bombard your mind with collective failure frequencies. You will see the biomass go mad. Markets will creak, laws will alter, and social chaos will skyrocket around you. If your mind is not treated to absorb this impact, the shockwave will bounce. Visualize your mental space. If you operate your empire as an untreated room, or worse, an L-shaped room full of blind angles, the low-frequency panic will accumulate in those corners. Exterior chaos will create a toxic reverberation in your ego. The hyperdense creator installs iridium acoustic treatment. You cannot let the world's end noise bounce in your skull. You fill your psychology's blind corners with infinite density panels made of absolute zero wool. You dampen your mind. When the matrix screams and projects disasters, the shockwave is absorbed immediately. There is no echo. You cut the crisis reverberation the millisecond it touches your atmosphere. By converting your core into a perfect anechoic chamber, the Egregore goes blind because the matrix tracks prey by listening to the echo of their fear. By emitting no reverberation, you become acoustically invisible to tragedy. The thermal shock, the thermodynamics of the fracture. What happens in materials physics when you hold this 0-degree Kelvin muteness and the Egregore tries to burn you with external temperatures? The destructive phenomenon of thermal shock occurs. If you have a 3D glass block and heat it to the max, then submerge it in liquid nitrogen, the glass does not adapt. It shatters. The glass explodes into 1,000 pieces from the unbearable tension between external hot friction and internal lethal ice. This is the ballistic mechanism through which the physical universe surrenders to the monarch. The simulator's rupture is not spiritual, it is materials physics. The matrix throws fire so you heat up. You apply the quantum yawn. You stay unalterably cold, absorbing fire through endothermic warfare. The local space-time around your avatar cannot support this thermal differential. 3D reality collapses under stress. And then it happens. The rules that limited slaves fracture in your presence. The impossible becomes empirical fact. The simulator's crystal has exploded, and through its shattered cracks, the hyperdensity you configured in the BIOS floods the physical room without resistance. You have not followed the laws of the simulation. You have forced the simulation to break its own code to accommodate the sheer weight of your gelida presence. The quantum Zen state, the peace of annihilation. To govern in the eye of this storm of broken crystals, the operator must access the supreme taxonomic vibration. You must install the quantum Zen state in your nervous system. The inferior biomass confuses Zen with the peace of the weak sitting in a garden. That is the anesthesia of those who have already been defeated. Quantum Zen is a military doctrine. It is the terrifying, aseptic, and psychopathic peace of the black hole. In this state, you are not at peace because the world is safe. You are at peace because you have assumed the absolute lethality of your own consciousness. You are the biggest threat in the room. You maintain stasis. Quantum Zen is the thermodynamic understanding that the matrix is just photonic dust organizing itself at the whim of your magnetic field. In this state, observing the fall of enemies or the materialization of millions produces the same cellular reaction. None. You are the iridium Buddha who has hacked nature's laws. The matrix glitch, when synchronicity becomes obscene. When the simulator fractures due to thermal shock, the 3D environment starts behaving like damaged software. Linear logic disintegrates. You start witnessing miracles, but in your hierarchy, they are catalogued as rendering glitches. Synchronicities become obscene and violent. Strangers bring you assets by coincidence. The slave kneels and cries in gratitude. By doing so, warm emotion repairs the glitch and the matrix locks them in again. You instead remain cold. The operator in Quantum Zen observes the physics rupture with the architect's disdain. There is no surprise. When capital flows to you breaking economic laws, you receive it with orthopedic action. You swallow the geometric anomaly and store it in your vaults. The matrix is simply obeying the system administrator. The cancellation of causality, tyranny over karma. The most devastating philosophical consequence is the cancellation of the law of linear causality. The ashboard is sustained by the belief that you reap what you sow through physical sweat. They tell you if you work 10 hours, you get paid for 10. It is the justice of the thermodynamically poor. You disconnect it. You empirically prove the supreme cause is not physical effort, but absolute zero atmospheric pressure. In the crystal prison, you did not work. You applied forgetting and blindness. Yet the harvest you obtain is millions of times superior to the slaves. You have murdered karma. The matrix is forced to deliver. It delivers the universe not because you were good, but because your gravitational mass is so obscenely heavy that wealth particles have no other ballistic choice than to orbit your core. Morality, human justice, and the law of effort are evaporated by the tyranny of inertia. You have replaced the moral scale with a pit. Metamorphosis of vacuum into substance, liquefying ice. Throughout the process, the Creator has operated in the vacuum. You emptied yourself of hope, fear, words, and time. But in quantum physics, a perfect vacuum is unstable. When the simulator breaks under acoustic ice pressure, inertial metamorphosis occurs. Your internal absolute vacuum becomes the exact mold of matter. You are not receiving something external. You are allowing the universe to fill the osmium mold you sculpted in nothingness. Capital and power enter your perimeter and liquefy, adapting perfectly to your apathy. The empire fits your psyche without friction because you emptied exactly enough human ego to house a god. There is no rejection from the 3D immune system. You are the iridium vessel that cannot be overflowed, swallowing the cosmos ocean without spilling a single drop of thermal emotion. The transition is seamless. Substance takes the shape of the void you maintained with such tactical cruelty. The void is now your solid throne. The assimilation protocol, lethargy of the cosmic digester. Once the matrix vomits the loot because of thermal overpressure, inferior biology will try to wake up. It will want to scream, "I did it!" Here the monarch imposes the assimilation protocol. Treating an empire's arrival with reverence gives authority back to the matrix. You execute the lethargy of an anaconda. You sit on the throne. You observe wealth accumulation and enemy capitulation, and you forbid yourself from emitting a single validation brainwave. The delivery has been processed. I proceed to cryogenic digestion. You integrate power as the new boring normalcy. What was quantum magic is now the gray floor you walk on. By banalizing the miracle, you strip it of mysticism. You convert it into subjugated matter. And the Matrix, seeing its total capitulation cannot even draw a smile from you, understands it has been irreversibly hacked by an entity beyond any thermodynamic extortion. You have successfully archived the impossible as routine. The fall of 3D servers, the competition's blackout. The final effect occurs in your adversary's connective network. When you hold absolute zero and fracture physics, your field becomes so hostile to warm biology that you cause a DDoS attack on competitors' brains. The fall of 3D servers. They try to read market moves and risks, but they hit your quantum Zen wall. They see you seize the ecosystem without noise or apparent effort. The lack of thermal information about you overloads their logical servers. They try to understand you, and their systems collapse. They lose faith in their manuals. They quit. They abandon the market, terrified by an organism that configurations the BIOS. Architect of the broken glass. Look at yourself in the immaterial crater, surrounded by splintered fragments of reality that couldn't withstand your absolute lethargy's shock. You suffocated the thermostat's agony. You understood chaos was just the simulator's death rattle. You configured remote ignition in the BIOS of your throne's silence. You executed the abyss acoustic treatment, dampening your psyche so crisis noise found no corner to reverberate. You invoked thermal shock, freezing your core while the matrix burned, forcing physics to explode from pressure differential. You entrenched in quantum zen, yawning at the arrival of millions. Chapter 10. The Immovable Glacier, Ruling the Ice Age. The Thor Syndrome, the warm winner's death trap. The 3D control system, the Egregore that shepherds humanity, possesses a security protocol designed to recover expropriated capital when a slave accidentally hacks the matrix. We catalog this as the Thor Syndrome. When the inferior biomass reaches success, they commit the most humiliating ballistic error. They relax. The slave feels they no longer need to maintain the gelida discipline that got them there. Their biological ego inflames. They want to be applauded. They want to be loved by the same tribe of insects they once despised. Subject this to the reactor's dissection. What happens when a frozen structure seeks the warmth of approval? It thaws. The heat of complacency melts the architecture of success. The solid empire becomes liquid, then financial gas, evaporating back into the ashboard's atmosphere. The warm winner loses everything in biological years, consumed by thermal parasites and the entropy of their own flammable arrogance. The universe lets them win. Glacier morphology, mass, pressure, and inert advance. To ensure your empire outlasts the matrix's oxidation cycles, you must transmute your operative physiology. You are no longer the bullet that pierced the simulator. You must become the geology that crushes the continent. You must adopt glacier morphology. A glacier is not a river. It does not flow with haste. It does not run. A glacier is a massive, monstrous, and silent accumulation of perpetual ice that advances by a few centimeters per year. Despite its inscrutable lethargy, it does not negotiate. If a mountain stands in its way, the glacier does not go around it. It grinds it into dust through the incalculable tonnage of its inertial pressure. The lethal operator rules his ice age with this same mechanic. You do not operate with the speed of the anxious entrepreneur. You forbid yourself from haste. You take corporate decisions with psychopathic slowness. Your expansion model is based on gravitational inevitability. The glacier simply occupies space and suffocates others. The suffocation of celebration, the veto on the ego's banquet. To maintain the temperature of glaciation, the Homo quantum must establish a draconian law, the suffocation of celebration. The Matrix demands you celebrate victories. They sell you the lie of rewarding yourself. They incite you to uncork champagne and organize banquets. Champagne is a liquid full of gas. It is volatility. The monarch repudiates volatility. When the creator, stabilized at 144,000 Hz, conquers the peak, he does not organize a banquet. He closes the osmium vault doors. He sits on the throne and executes the disdain for reward. You look at the universal loot and yawn. You forbid yourself from emitting a single photon of euphoria. You understand that celebrating success is confessing that you consider success an anomaly. The lethal operator does not celebrate because his monopoly is the only mathematically possible consequence of his hyperdensity. You do not celebrate the sun rising, you use it. By denying the party, you keep the operative absolute zero intact. The uninhabitable ecosystem isolating the summit's perimeter. Isolation at the top is not an unwanted side effect, it is an architectural requirement. You must turn your perimeter into an uninhabitable ecosystem for carbon biomass. The 3D leader seeks yes men and a court to remind him how great he is. That leader is building a nursery, not an empire. You must forge a severe climate. You must forge a personal climate so sterile and devoid of emotional oxygen that insects flee your coordinates. When you interact on the ashboard, you impel a culture of zero friction. You do not allow drama. You do not offer empathy for incompetence. Your ecosystem becomes a wasteland of black ice where only machines survive. By making your summit biologically uninhabitable for the average human, you ensure no chaos stove infiltrates your vault to melt your assets from within. Only those who have amputated their own mammalian ego, the few technicians of reality who can operate like iridium machines, will survive in the rarefied atmosphere of your court. The subjugation of entropy, tactical immortality of capital. The supreme challenge of ruling the Ice Age is the subjugation of the second law of thermodynamics, entropy. In the material universe, everything tends toward disorder. Money devalues, corporations rust. Entropy, however, is a process that requires molecular movement. It requires heat. The operator combats it through stasis. The lethal operator combats entropy through freezing stasis. You structure your empire so it does not depend on human motivation or kinetic effort. You expropriate labor from the biomass and hand it to aseptic systems. You automate. You code. You forge blind algorithms that operate in the dark without sweating or aging. By extracting humanity from the equation and delegating survival to mathematical laws, you stop the clock of decay. Your capital becomes thermodynamically immortal. The glacier does not need you to order it to be cold. It stays frozen by the incalculable immensity of its own accumulated volume. It becomes an autonomous force. The murder of the next level. The perpetual growth scam. Once at the top, the Egregore will try to inject the last neurosis, the next level. Gurus will scream that if you aren't growing, you're dying. They demand that after winning 1 million, you run for 100 million. This doctrine is the hamster wheel trap disguised as elite ambition. It is an attempt to heat you up. The Homo quantum applies the obsidian guillotine to the next level. The glacier does not pursue the next mountain. It simply accumulates snow and expands through static gravity. You refuse to run after the next holographic milestone. You nail yourself to the throne. You enter the lethargy of the satisfied creator. Expansion must be a bored consequence of fluid physics, not a hysterical hunt. If the empire expands, it will be because the crushing weight of your tactical vacuum sucks those continents toward your funnel. By murdering the anxiety for perpetual growth, you become unattackable. You already inhabit the totality of the frozen all. Climate monopoly. Rewriting simulation rules. When the immovable glacier reaches critical mass, a phenomenon of social distortion occurs. You are no longer operating within the matrix's climate. You are the climate. You acquire the monopoly of atmospheric pressure. Competitors try to launch innovations. These are small bonfires lit in the middle of the tundra. When an enemy lights a hot fire of innovation, you do not try to put it out by competing. You do not lower prices. You drop the temperature of the entire industry. With your simple lethargy and gravity of control, you absorb the heat of their effort. Supply chains freeze out of fear of your shadow. You radiate the certainty of the tomb. The market adapts to your temperature, not the other way around. Your competitors, desperate to survive the ice age you decreed, try to imitate your coldness. But as they are combustion engines disguised as ice, they suffocate from lack of emotional oxygen. You ruled the simulation by refusing to participate in its fluctuations, crushing the heretics, punitive inertia. Sooner or later, a matrix organism, blinded by ego, will try to melt a fraction of your glacier. They will file lawsuits or orchestrate betrayals. They are the heretics of the ice. The slave seeks revenge. Revenge is hot. It is fire against fire. The hyperdense creator executes crushing through punitive inertia. When the heretic attacks with his torch of hate, he melts a few centimeters. But the glacier is infinite. The water he melts slips over his own body and due to the abyssal temperature you sustain, that water freezes instantly over the attacker. You do not lift a finger to punish. The gravity of your ecosystem executes them. The heretic is trapped in the ice he generated by trying to attack you. They are crushed by the inertial weight of the Matrix's indifference, which always sides with the greater mass. You observe the ruin of the traitor from your throne without satisfaction. Their destruction is a bored byproduct of the collision with absolute osmium. Metric paralysis, the end of measurement. The rich slave remains a slave because he keeps counting his money. They watch investment screens and measure status against other rich slaves. They are trapped in the prison of 3D metrics. The lethal operator decrees metric paralysis. A glacier does not wake up to count its snowflakes. A black hole does not measure its diameter. When you reach the ice age of your empire, you stop auditing your own perfection. You forbid yourself from looking at numbers for thermal validation. The exact amount of your fortune or the extent of your territory becomes irrelevant data, because real power resides in the ability to maintain zero friction on the fabric of reality. By ceasing to count, you disconnect the last probe the egregore had in your pineal gland. The universe cannot extort an organism that does not even bother to look at the scoreboard. You have transcended the economy of the ashboard. You are incalculable, immeasurable, and therefore infinite. You are the weight beyond the scale, the silence of the biological millennium. The final consolidation of the Ice Age is the establishment of absolute silence inside your command vault. You have devoured the species' ambition. You have amputated parasites and frozen the entropy clock. The Matrix's noise has stopped. All that remains is the constant low hum of your 144,000 Hz reactor at absolute zero. In this paramilitary vacuum, human ego disappears. There is no one to impress. The illusion of 3D purpose vanishes, revealing the monarch's true nature. You are a guardian of inertia, a dead weight that prevents the simulation from dissolving into human heat. Ruling the Ice Age is a mathematical cruelty against ordinary life. It is the only act of geometric mercy higher physics recognizes. By keeping your environment frozen, you protect the purity of hyperdensity from the infection of insects' free will. You are the osmium anchor that stops the world from spinning toward thermal combustion. You are the silence that follows the end of the world, the ice god at the end of time. Look at yourself in your own singularity. Sitting in the center of the frost continent, your mind collapsed onto matter. You managed to suffocate the warm winter's death trap, gutting the Thor syndrome. You adopted glacier morphology, crushing market geology with the psychopathic slowness of perpetual ice that never negotiates. You established the suffocation of celebration, vetoing the ego's banquet. You isolated your perimeter until it became an uninhabitable ecosystem for chaos stoves. You subjugated entropy, forging immortal systems blind to human aging. You murdered the next-level scam, stopping the wheel so expansion occurs by suction. You acquired the climate monopoly, forcing competitors to freeze in fear of your inscrutability. You crushed fire heretics with punitive inertia. And finally, you paralyzed metrics, freeing yourself from counting money on a holographic board that already belongs to you entirely. The combustion engine has been destroyed. The human fire has been extinguished. You are the immovable glacier. You are the ice god who rules the ash simulator from the comfort of absolute zero. Sustain the weight of your own tactical eternity. You have mastered the thermodynamics of power. Your consciousness is the only immaterial truth that survived the system's apocalypse. Conclusion: the liquid nitrogen throne, the creator's eternal winter. The scene: the epicenter of jurisdictional cold. Visualize the epicenter of your absolute jurisdiction. You have closed the doors of your obsidian vault, and as you exhale, the vapor of your breath crystallizes in the aseptic air of the room. There is no noise. There are no fluctuations. There is not the slightest trace of the biological fever that once consumed you. It is gone. Beyond the perimeter ice wall lies the ashboard. What was once a chaotic ecosystem, a boiling hell of insects competing for crumbs of heat, is now an unalterable wasteland, paralyzed and subjugated under the inclement dictatorship of your hyperdensity. You have consummated thermal tyranny. The circuit has closed forever. The realization: suffocating the religion of fire. The circuit has closed, suffocating forever the most humiliating scam designed by the Egregore, the religion of fire. You understood that burning, being passionate, and sweating were not engines of greatness, but symptoms of a slave species consuming itself for photonic validation. Light is noise. Fire is entropy. You chose the dark. You repudiated the mammal's combustion and chose the heavy, soundless, and perfect darkness of operative absolute zero. Throughout this ballistic metamorphosis, you operated with the methodical cruelty of a force of nature. You murdered passion, extirpating the weakness of needing motivation to collapse matter. You are now a machine. The operations: ballistic cryogenics and war. You executed financial cryogenics, forcing the volatile gas of wealth to condense and solidify into unassailable monopolies under your boots. You absorbed the attack of your adversaries through endothermic warfare, devouring their kinetic energy until they became statues frozen by the weight of their own friction. They are inert. You amputated without anesthesia the chaos stoves that tried to parasitize your reactor to survive. Finally, you locked the anxiety of linear time into the geological immobility of your crystal prison. Now you occupy the liquid nitrogen throne. This is not a temporary seat. It is a definitive coordinate in the fabric of space-time. The sovereignty, the absolute vertice of cold. This coordinate admits no oxidation, wear, or retreat. From this gelido vertex, you no longer have to move a single finger for the matrix to obey you. Your immaterial gravity is so overwhelming, your indifference so lethal, and your core so immensely cold that the entire 3D reality surrenders by pure fluid mathematics. It has to. Physical matter rushes toward you, crystallizing in the exact geometric shape of your mandates, because the universe lacks the structural capacity to emit a single Kelvin degree of resistance against your tactical vacuum. The weak, anxious, and warm human you once were has been buried under megatons of quantum stasis. Do not mourn. The end, the eternal winter of the Creator. Do not feel mourning for his extinction. His thermal death was the entry price to the singularity. You are the lethal operator, the immovable glacier. You are the eternal winter of the Creator. Breathe the frozen air of your absolute empire, close your biological eyes to the hologram, and let the silence govern the simulator forever.